The Pokemon world holds its breath at the edge of every unanswered question, and some of the most compelling mysteries are the ones that were never meant to be mysteries at all. They settled quietly into the lore, into the code, into the background details of games and episodes that most players pass through without pausing. But certain questions, once noticed, are very difficult to set aside, and if you let them carry you gently, they can take you somewhere that feels both familiar and strange at once. There are mysteries woven into every region of the Pokemon world, and tonight we are going to move through them together, one careful step at a time. And before you drift any further, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this. And thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. Every Pokemon game begins in a small bedroom. That is a detail so consistent, so repeated across generations, that most players have stopped noticing it entirely. You wake up in a modest room with a bed, a computer, a television, and just enough space to feel like a real place rather than a stage. The room does not have a door to the outside world. It always has a staircase leading downward, and waiting at the bottom is a version of an ordinary life. A parent, a meal, a town that has existed long before you arrived in it. What makes that room interesting is not what it contains, but what it represents. It is the last moment of stillness before everything begins. It is the quiet before the world opens up. The bedroom is also a kind of promise. Every time the series has returned to that small, familiar space, it has been telling players something important. No matter how large the world becomes, no matter how many legendary Pokemon are caught, or how many champions are defeated, the journey begins in a quiet room with a window and a morning light. There is something deeply reassuring about that continuity. It suggests that the adventure does not erase the beginning. It grows outward from it. What is less discussed is how those rooms change across generations. In the earliest games, the bedroom was sparse and deliberately simple, a reflection of hardware limitations as much as design intention. But as the series evolved, those rooms became richer. Bookshelves filled with readable text, posters on the walls depicting the wider world, items tucked away that hinted at the protagonist's personality before they had spoken a single word. Each game has quietly been building a portrait of who you are before you become whoever you choose to be, and that portrait has always been built from small, easily overlooked details. The television in the protagonist's bedroom has always been a subtle source of lore. In the earliest games, turning on the television yielded simple programming, weather reports, news fragments, and brief references to events happening elsewhere in the world. These broadcasts were rarely connected to the main story. They were background noise, the kind of information that suggests a living world without requiring the player to engage with it directly. But over time, those broadcasts began to contain references that were harder to dismiss. Events mentioned on television sometimes foreshadowed things that would happen later in the game. Other broadcasts referenced regions the player had never visited, places that would not become accessible until years later in entirely different games. The world of Pokemon has always been larger than any single game can contain. And the television, in that small bedroom, was one of the earliest hints that the designers knew it. The world existed before the player arrived in it. It would continue to exist after they left. The broadcasts playing in the background were evidence of that continuity, quiet proof that the protagonist was not the center of everything, only the center of this particular story. There is a question that sits at the heart of every Pokemon mystery, and it has to do with time. The Pokemon world exists in a version of the present, but it also contains a deep and layered past. Ruins fill the landscape of every region. Ancient carvings depict Pokemon and humans living together in ways that suggest the relationship between the two is far older than any recorded history the games provide. The ruins of Alph, the Sealed Chamber, the Celestic Town ruins, the Celestian ruins. Each of these locations suggests that civilizations once understood Pokemon in ways that have been entirely forgotten. What those civilizations knew and why that knowledge was lost is one of the longest running unanswered questions in the series. The inscriptions left behind are often only partially translated. The meaning shifts depending on who you ask and which game you are playing. Some ruins suggest that ancient humans were capable of communicating directly with legendary Pokemon. Others imply that certain Pokemon were worshipped as gods, not metaphorically, but in a way that came very close to accurate. The boundary between mythology and history in the Pokemon world is unusually thin. One of the most striking examples of this thinness is the mythology surrounding the creation of the world itself. In the Sinnoh region, the story of Arceus creating existence from nothing is not presented as folklore or legend in the way creation myths typically are in our world. It is presented as something that actually happened. There are people in the game who speak about it as recorded history rather than inherited belief. The Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, are said to have given humans knowledge, emotion, and willpower. These are not metaphors. They are described as literal gifts, events that shaped what humanity became. This raises a question that the games have never answered directly. If Pokemon gave humans their defining qualities, what were humans before that happened? The mythology implies that human beings existed in a prior state, one that lacked the emotional and cognitive capacities that now define them. The idea that a Pokemon is responsible for the human capacity for feeling is quietly one of the most profound things the series has ever suggested, and it was placed in a mountainside cave surrounded by puzzles about Unown, easy to walk past without pausing. The Unown themselves are a mystery that has only deepened with time. They first appeared in the Johto region, carved into the walls of the ruins of Alph, resembling an alphabet of ancient symbols. Each Unown corresponds to a letter, a question mark, or an exclamation point. They drift through dark spaces, emitting a faint psychic energy that seems to have no clear purpose. The Pokédex describes them as having existed since ancient times and suggests that their relationship to written language is unclear, whether Unown inspired human alphabets or human alphabets gave shape to the Unown remains unknown. That ambiguity is not accidental. The Unown occupy a space between language and life. They are symbols that breathe, letters that float. Their existence raises a question that goes beyond Pokemon biology and touches something closer to philosophy. If thought can be given physical form, what does that say about the nature of thought itself? The Unown are not powerful in the way legendary Pokemon are powerful. They do not control the weather or bend time or govern the sea. But in groups, their power becomes something else entirely. In the third Pokemon film, a child's imagination, given form through the Unown, reshaped reality in ways that even legendary Pokemon struggled to counter. Alone, an Unown is almost nothing. Together, they can remake the worlds. There is something quiet and unsettling about that idea. The Unown are the only Pokemon whose power scales entirely with collective presence. They are a reminder that in the Pokemon world, the most extraordinary things are not always the most dramatic. Some of the deepest mysteries hide in plain sight, looking like letters on a cave wall. The concept of Pokemon dreams is another thread that runs through the series in ways that are rarely discussed openly. Drowsy and Hypno are famous for their relationship to human dreams, feeding on the emotions and imagery produced during sleep. But the lore surrounding these Pokemon is darker than it first appears. Hypno, in particular, is described as sometimes luring children away with its pendulum, drawn to the vivid quality of young imaginations. The Pokédex is careful in how it describes this, but the implication is consistent across multiple entries. Hypno does not merely observe dreams, it extracts them, and what happens to a mind from which something has been taken is never fully addressed. The question of what Pokemon experience during sleep is separate from what they do to human dreams, and it is equally interesting. Jigglypuff puts others to sleep, famously and involuntarily, and becomes visibly frustrated when its audience fails to stay awake. But where does Jigglypuff go when it sleeps? The same question applies to Snorlax, a Pokemon that sleeps for enormous portions of its existence. Snorlax is described as having dreams so powerful that they occasionally cause it to walk in its sleep. What those dreams contain is never specified. A creature that sleeps that deeply is experiencing something, and the games are content to leave that experience unexamined. The Pokemon world treats sleep differently than our world does. It is not just a state of rest, it is a vulnerability, a condition that can be imposed by others, and a space in which certain Pokemon choose to exist for reasons that are presented as natural but never explained. Darkrai is the most explicit example, a mythical Pokemon that is described as being unable to help but giving nearby people and Pokemon terrible nightmares. Darkrai does not do this out of malice, according to the lore. It is simply what Darkrai is, a presence that cannot be turned off, a shadow that happens to be alive. The distinction between Darkrai's nightmares and Cresselia's ability to grant peaceful sleep mirrors a balance that runs through the Pokemon world in many forms. For nearly every force that unsettles, there is a counterpart that soothes. This balance is rarely explained as deliberate design. It is simply the way things are. The world has dark places and luminous ones, and they exist in relation to each other in a way that feels stable without ever being perfectly understood. One of the most persistent mysteries in Pokemon lore is the question of what happened before the player arrived. Every game begins with a world already in motion. People have already experienced things. Towns have already changed. Relationships have already formed and broken. The rival in the original games is already confident, already ahead, already someone who has spent more time thinking about Pokemon than the player has. There is a whole history happening just out of frame, and the protagonist enters it from the side rather than from the beginning. This becomes especially interesting when you consider Professor Oak. In the original Pokemon Red and Blue, Oak is already a world-famous researcher with decades of study behind him. He has strong opinions about which Pokemon make good starters. He knows the landscape well enough to warn the player away from tall grass at the start of the journey. But there are hints, scattered carefully across the games, that Oak's past is more complicated than his gentle professorial presence suggests. He is described in some places as having once been a Pokemon trainer himself. His rivalry with another trainer, hinted at but never fully explored in the main games, is the kind of story that feels like it was nearly told and then decided against. The question of who Professor Oak was before he became Professor Oak is the kind of question the Pokemon world invites and then declines to answer. It is not a gap in the narrative. It feels more like a deliberate space, room left for the player's imagination to settle into. The world is rich enough that the characters who populate it feel like they had lives before the camera found them, and that feeling is one of the things that makes Pokemon lore so quietly compelling. The ghost-type Pokemon are perhaps the most philosophically interesting category in the entire series. On the surface, they are simply a type classification, a set of creatures that resist certain moves and are weak to others. But the implications of what a ghost-type Pokemon actually is have always been left deliberately unresolved. The Pokédex describes many ghost types as having been, at some point, alive in a different form. Gengar is widely theorized to be the ghost of a Clefable, based on their nearly identical silhouettes. Yamask carries a mask that was once its human face, according to its Pokédex entry, and sometimes stops to look at that mask and weep. That Yamask entry is one of the most striking pieces of text in the entire Pokemon franchise. It is presented without elaboration, without context, without any attempt to soften what it suggests. Yamask was once human. It remembers this. It carries a physical remnant of what it was, and that remnant causes it grief. The games do not offer a theory for how this transformation happened. They do not indicate whether it is common or rare. They simply state it as fact and move on, leaving the reader to sit with the weight of it. Ghost types in general exist in a space between states. They are described as living, but also as dead, or post-dead, or beyond any category that has a clean name. Shedinja is another striking example. It is the shed skin of Ninkata, an empty shell that somehow became inhabited by something. Its ability is Wonder Guard, which means only super effective moves can damage it. But the unsettling detail isn't in its appearance. Shedinja has a hole in its back, and the Pokédex warns that looking into that hole will pull your soul out. This warning is issued casually, as a piece of trivia. The game does not follow up on it. The casualness is the point. The Pokemon world is full of genuinely dangerous things that are described as though they are simply ordinary features of the landscape. Haunter's touch can cause uncontrollable laughter that leads to death. Spiritomb is a collection of 500 malevolent spirits bound into a keystone as punishment. Pelosin consumes the life energy of small Pokemon and hides the remains under its sand. These are not horror game details. They are Pokédex entries. They are presented alongside information about height and weight and habitat. The world simply contains these things, and the people who live in it have apparently made a kind of peace with their presence. What that peace says about the culture of the Pokemon world is worth considering slowly. In our world, a creature capable of killing by touch would not be treated as a companion animal. It would be a disaster or a legend. In the Pokemon world, it is simply a Pokemon, one that requires a certain kind of trainer to handle it safely perhaps, but a Pokemon nonetheless. The boundary between what is dangerous and what is acceptable in the Pokemon world is drawn in a very different place than we would draw it here, and examining where that boundary falls reveals something about the underlying values of the world and the people who live in it. The relationship between Pokemon and death has always been one of the most carefully navigated topics in the series. The games rarely show death directly. Pokemon faint in battle, but they recover. Characters reference loss, but it is usually positioned carefully to avoid being too heavy for the series' younger audience. And yet the lore around death in the Pokemon world is remarkably developed. Lavender Town is the most famous example, a quiet gray town in Kanto built around a tower devoted to honoring Pokemon who have died. The music that plays there in the original games was described by many players as one of the most unsettling things they had encountered in a game aimed at children. The tower itself is called Pokemon Tower, and it is exactly what it sounds like, a place where Pokemon are buried and where their spirits sometimes remain. The player must climb through floors populated by ghost-type Pokemon and by the wandering spirit of a Marowak who was killed by Team Rocket. That detail, that the tower contains the ghost of a specific Pokemon who died violently as a result of human cruelty, is one of the earliest moments in the series where the games acknowledge that Pokemon can be harmed in ways that are not reversed by a visit to a Pokémon Center. The Marowak's ghost does not speak. It does not explain itself. It simply stands in the tower blocking the path, unwilling or unable to move on, and the player must eventually help it find whatever peace is available to a ghost. How that peace is found and what it means for the Marowak's existence afterward is not discussed. The spirit disappears, and the tower continues as before, but the moment leaves a mark on the world that does not fade. There is a Pokémon that died in this game. There was a mother, and now there is a ghost. And for a few floors of a tower in a gray town, the player is asked to sit with that. The Pokémon world's relationship with legendary beings is another mystery that deepens the more closely you examine it. Legendary Pokémon are not presented uniformly across the series. Some are treated as myths that may or may not have existed. Others are demonstrably present, walking through caves or soaring over roots in ways that make their existence undeniable. And some exist at a level of power so far beyond ordinary Pokémon that the word legendary barely covers what they represent. Arceus created the universe. Dialga governs time, Palkia governs space, Giratina governs antimatter, and the Distortion World, a mirror reality that underlies the Pokémon universe in ways that are never fully described. These are not powerful animals. These are forces given form, entities whose existence shapes the conditions under which all other life is possible. The fact that a child with 6 Pokémon can challenge and potentially capture them is, from a certain angle, one of the stranger things in the entire franchise. But that strangeness is also part of what makes Pokémon so interesting to think about. The games present power at every scale simultaneously. A caterpillar learning to harden its shell, a god learning to have a master. The distance between those two things is enormous, and the series moves across it as though the distance were not particularly strange. Part of what the games suggest is that in the Pokémon world, the bond between trainer and Pokémon is itself a force. That connection changes what is possible. It allows small things to grow into large ones, and it allows beings of unimaginable power to choose a partner rather than existing entirely alone. The mystery of why legendary Pokémon accept capture at all is one that the games occasionally gesture toward without resolving. Dialga and Palkia, beings who can control the flow of time and the shape of space, submit to a small red and white sphere thrown by a 10-year-old child. The in-universe explanation, when one is offered, tends to involve the trainer demonstrating worthiness through battle, but the deeper question is why a deity would recognize the authority of a small plastic ball in the first place. Some fan theories suggest that legendary Pokémon allow themselves to be captured when they feel the trainer is someone worth accompanying, that the capture is consent rather than defeat. This interpretation is never confirmed, but it sits more comfortably with the scale of these beings than the alternative. The mythology of the Sinnoh region, in particular, is built with unusual care. The Pokémon Platinum game introduced the Distortion World, Giratina's realm, as a physically realized location that players could explore. That world operates on different rules. Gravity is unreliable. Perspective shifts in ways that suggest the usual logic of space does not apply. Giratina lives there because it was banished by Arceus for its violent nature. The exact nature of that violence is never described. But the idea that even a creator deity has lines it will enforce, and that the cost of crossing those lines is exile to a place beyond the ordinary world, is quietly one of the most developed pieces of mythology the series has ever produced. Giratina is often overlooked in favor of the more immediately dramatic Dialga and Palkia, but Giratina's existence raises questions the other two do not. If it was banished, who determined the terms of that banishment? Arceus, presumably, but Arceus's motivations are described only in the broadest terms. What did Giratina do that was severe enough to earn exile from the world itself? And what did Giratina do during all those years alone in the Distortion World before any human found their way there? The game does not answer these questions. The silence around them is enormous. The concept of Pokémon evolution has always carried a mystery beneath its familiar surface. Evolution in Pokémon is not the same as evolution in biology. It is faster, it is individual, and it is often triggered by emotional or relational factors that biology alone cannot explain. A Pokemon that feels loved evolves. A Pokemon that has spent time near certain locations evolves. A Pokemon that reaches a specific understanding of a move it has been practicing evolves. These are not genetic processes. They are closer to transformations of identity, moments where a creature becomes something it was always capable of being. The philosophical implications of this kind of evolution are rarely discussed in the games, but they are interesting to sit with. If a Pokemon can change its fundamental form because of the emotional quality of its relationship with a trainer, then the bond between trainer and Pokemon is not just an attachment, it is a shaping force. The trainer is not merely a caretaker. They are, in some sense, a condition that makes certain kinds of becoming possible. This makes the trainer-Pokemon relationship feel different from pet ownership and different from partnership. It is something the series invented and for which there is not quite a name. The Moonstone, Thunderstone, Firestone, and other elemental stones trigger evolution in ways that suggest Pokemon biology responds to something beyond training alone. These stones have existed since ancient times in the lore, found in ruins, traded by ancient civilizations, clearly understood by societies that no longer exist. The fact that modern people still use them without fully understanding their mechanism is a detail the games do not dwell on, but it suggests that the relationship between humans and Pokemon evolution is older and more complicated than the game's present-day setting implies. There is a subtle mystery embedded in the geography of the Pokemon world that most players absorb without quite noticing. The regions of the Pokemon world are islands or peninsulas or clearly bounded territories, separated by oceans that are rarely crossed. The connections between regions are almost always made by sea, and those sea routes are treated as significant journeys. You do not simply walk from Kanto to Johto the way you might drive between neighboring states. The journey has weight, it takes time. The world feels large even when a map suggests it should not. This bounded geography has a curious effect on the Pokemon world's sense of mystery. Within each region, the world feels knowable, mapped, contained. Every route has been walked, every cave has been explored, every town has been named. But beyond the edges of each map, the sense of the unknown grows considerably. The ocean surrounding Hoenn contains things that are not on any map. The seas around Alola are deep in ways the game does not fully account for. The routes between regions are traveled regularly, and yet the spaces beyond them feel genuinely unexplored. Kyogre is a Pokemon that has shaped the physical geography of the world. It is described as having created the world's oceans by causing massive downpours that filled the land with water. If this is literally true, then every ocean in the Pokemon world is, in some sense, Kyogre's ocean. Every ship that crosses it is sailing through a space that Kyogre made. Every island that exists does so because Kyogre stopped short of covering it. The world's geography is not neutral. It is a record of ancient Pokemon activity, a landscape written by creatures whose scale of action made mountains and seas. Groudon expanded the continents. Rayquaza governs the sky. These three Pokemon, the Weather Trio as they are often called, are responsible for the basic conditions of habitability in the Pokemon world. Without them, or without the balance they represent, the world would be uninhabitable. The games acknowledge this in the stories of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, where the awakening of Kyogre and Groudon poses an existential threat to the entire region. But what is easy to miss is that this threat is not unusual in the history of the Pokemon world. It has happened before, perhaps many times. The current stability of the world is the result of a balance that was achieved through conflict and is maintained only as long as that conflict stays contained. The people of the Pokémon world live inside the product of ancient cosmic events. Their mountains are monuments to Grudin. Their seas are Kyogre's gift and its power. Their ability to exist at all depends on the continued restraint of forces that could unmake the world if they chose to act again. And they go about their days, tending their gardens and running their shops, beneath skies kept stable by a creature that sleeps in the ozone layer and descends only when the world below it requires intervention. There is a quality to Pokemon that the games often gesture toward but rarely name, and it has to do with loyalty. Pokemon that have been with a trainer for a long time develop attachments that are described in the games as genuine. They remember kindness, they respond to familiar voices, they learn to anticipate what their trainer will ask of them. The bond that grows through travel and battle and care is not merely mechanical. It changes the Pokemon in ways that go beyond stronger moves or higher statistics. The friendship mechanic, present in various forms across multiple generations, is the most explicit acknowledgement of this. Certain evolutions are only possible when a Pokemon's friendship is high enough. But more than the evolution mechanism, the concept of friendship in Pokemon suggests that these creatures are capable of genuine emotional response, not just trained behavior. Espeon and Umbreon, for example, evolved from Eevee based entirely on the strength and nature of the bond with their trainer. No item, no level threshold, just relationship. The form the Pokemon takes is determined by the quality of the connection it has built. This makes Eevee one of the most philosophically interesting Pokemon in the series. It is famously capable of evolving into many different forms, and the available forms span almost the entire type spectrum. What it becomes depends on factors that include where it has been, what has been done to it, and who it has been with. Eevee is the Pokemon that most clearly demonstrates that identity in this world is not fixed at birth. It is shaped by experience, by environment, and by relationship. And that shaping is not a metaphor, it is a biological reality. The idea of a creature whose fundamental form is determined by experience rather than genetics is one that invites slow, quiet contemplation. Eevee in the wild, without a trainer, without exposure to elemental stones or specific locations, simply remains Eevee. It does not evolve. The catalyst for becoming something more, for any of its forms, requires an encounter with something beyond itself. A stone, a place, a person. The potential was always there, but potential, without the right conditions, remains potential. There are Pokemon in the series whose existence raises questions about the nature of individual identity in ways that are easy to miss on a first playthrough. Wishiwashi is one. In its solo form, it is described as one of the weakest Pokemon in the ocean, small and fragile and seemingly unremarkable. But Wishiwashi has an ability called schooling, and when it uses this ability, thousands of individual Wishiwashi merge into a single enormous school that functions as one entity. The combined school is one of the most physically imposing forms in the game. Pokédex entries describe Pokémon that would ordinarily dominate the ocean retreating when the Wishiwashi school appears. What is strange about this is the question of what the school actually is. Is it one Pokemon or many? When Wishiwashi school, do they retain individual awareness, or does the group form something like a collective consciousness? The game does not answer this. The ability functions mechanically, and the lore describes the behavior, but the inner experience of the schooling Wishiwashi is left entirely open. There is something quietly profound about a creature so small that its only real power is the willingness to combine, to give up individual separateness in service of something larger than any individual could become. Malamar is another Pokemon whose lore deserves slow consideration. Its Pokédex entries describe it as possessing the most powerful hypnotic ability of any Pokémon, capable of bending even the strongest willed person to its desires. But more specifically, certain entries describe Malamar as having ambitions, specific goals it works toward, and the capacity to manipulate humans over long periods of time to achieve those goals. Malamar does not merely hypnotize, it strategizes, it plans. It is among the small number of Pokemon described as having intentional, long-term motivations beyond survival or territorial defense. This makes Malamar unusual in a very specific way. Most Pokemon, even powerful or dangerous ones, are described as acting from instinct. They hunt because they are hungry. They protect because they feel threatened. They gather energy because their biology requires it. Malamar, by contrast, is described as wanting things, not just needing things, and the things it wants appear to be related to power in ways that are uncomfortably reminiscent of human ambition. The series sometimes blurs the line between Pokemon and people in interesting ways, and Malamar is one of the places where that blurring happens most quietly. The mythology surrounding the origin of Pokemon themselves is a question the series has approached from several directions without ever fully resolving. One of the deepest clues exists in the Pokemon Platinum game, in a book found inside a mansion in Canalave City. The passage describes a time before Pokemon existed as distinct from the world, when all things were still one. It describes the original Pokemon emerging from eggs into a world that was not yet named. These descriptions do not perfectly match any single creation mythology offered elsewhere in the series, which raises the possibility that the Pokemon world has multiple origin stories, none of which tells the complete truth. The idea of multiple incomplete truths is one that sits comfortably with how the Pokemon world handles its own history. Different regions have different mythologies for the same events. And what one region calls a god of creation, another calls a great dragon. What one culture remembers as a catastrophe, another recalls as a blessing. The Pokemon world is not a place with a single authoritative history. It is a place where knowledge is partial, perspective is location dependent, and certainty is rare. The player moves through this world collecting fragments without ever receiving a complete picture. That incompleteness is not a flaw. It is the texture of the world. It is what makes the world feel inhabited rather than constructed. Real places do not have complete histories available on request. They have layers, and most of those layers are inaccessible, buried under other layers, or simply forgotten. The Pokemon world has that quality, a sense that more happened here than any single narrative can contain, and that the traces left behind are worth examining even when they do not resolve into clean answers. The Pokemon world's history of human-Pokemon conflict is another thread that deserves unhurried attention. The games typically present a vision of partnership and coexistence as the dominant mode of the relationship between the two, but the history underlying that partnership is more complicated. There are ruins that suggest wars involving Pokemon. There are artifacts that imply humans and Pokemon were once in opposition. The AZ plotline in Pokemon X and Y, in which a king built a weapon capable of ending the lives of countless Pokemon in order to save the one he loved, and was then cursed with endless life as a consequence, is one of the most developed treatments of this tension in the series. Aziz's story suggests that the current peace between humans and Pokemon was not inevitable. It was earned through suffering, through choices made by individuals, through the slow work of building trust across a divide that was once much wider. The legendary Pokemon Xerneas and Yveltal, who govern life and death respectively, are not neutral forces. They are involved in the history of humanity in ways that carry moral weight. The world was shaped by choices made in darkness, and the brightness of the present is partly an achievement, something maintained by effort rather than simply given. The question of what Pokemon think about humans is almost never directly answered in the games. Pokemon communicate in their own sounds, in moves, in behavior. A small number can communicate through psychic means, and those rare conversations suggest that Pokemon have complex inner lives that humans rarely fully understand. Mewtwo is the most developed example of a Pokemon who can articulate its relationship to humanity, and what it articulates is complicated. Not simple hatred and not simple acceptance, something more like ambivalence, a recognition that humans are capable of both cruelty and care, and that its own existence sits at the intersection of the two. Mewtwo was created from the genetic material of Mew through human scientific intervention. It was not born, it was made. It did not come into the world through the natural processes that other Pokemon experience, and from the moment of its creation, it was treated as a resource rather than a person. The story of what Mewtwo did in response, and what it eventually chose to believe about itself and about humanity, is one of the oldest narratives in the franchise, and one that has never fully resolved. Mewtwo remains in the world somewhere, making choices about what kind of being it wants to be. The games allow it that much, at least. The nature of Pokemon communication is a mystery that touches on questions the series has explored in small, careful ways without making them central. Most Pokemon produce sounds that consist of their own names in the anime or digital tones in the games. This convention is so familiar that it has become invisible, something players accept without considering what it implies. But the implication is interesting. If a Pikachu says only variations of the sound that constitutes its name, is that language? Is it the expression of identity? Is it something else entirely, a kind of frequency that carries meaning beyond what the sounds literally contain? Psychic-type Pokemon bypass this question by communicating through thought rather than sound. When a trainer encounters a Pokemon like Alakazam or Gardevoir in lore contexts, they are sometimes described as receiving impressions, emotions, or images rather than words. This suggests that Pokemon communication, at its most developed, is closer to direct emotional transfer than to language as humans understand it. The barrier between Pokemon experience and human experience is permeable in these moments, and what passes through is something more immediate than translation allows for. The way Pokemon experience time is another dimension that the games address obliquely through specific Pokemon descriptions. Celebi is described as a time traveler, moving through different eras of the world's history, sometimes carrying others with it. Dialga's existence is inseparable from the passage of time, but more interesting in some ways is Slowpoke. Slowpoke is described as being so slow to process sensation that it sometimes takes 5 seconds to feel pain after being bitten on the tail. This is presented as comedy, as one of Slowpoke's endearing qualities. But it also suggests that not all Pokemon experience the world at the same temporal resolution. A Pokemon that perceives the world 5 seconds behind the moment it is happening in is not merely slow. It is experiencing a different relationship to the present than other creatures experience. What Slowpoke's inner world feels like, whether it is a serene and unhurried version of reality or something more disorienting, is a question the games do not ask. But it is a question that opens up into interesting spaces. The Pokemon world is full of creatures whose relationship to time, sensation, and awareness is significantly different from anything human biology has produced. And those differences are usually presented as traits rather than mysteries, as facts rather than puzzles. Slowpoke's evolution occurs when a shelter clamps onto Slowpoke's tail. The shelter's toxins then affect Slowpoke's brain, and something about that chemical interaction triggers a shift in Slowpoke's cognitive and physical development. The shelter becomes a permanent part of Slowbro, spinning on its tail, and is described as experiencing a kind of ecstasy from this arrangement. Two creatures, previously separate, become a single organism that is genuinely different from either of them alone. This is one of the more quietly radical things in Pokémon evolution. The idea that becoming something new sometimes requires incorporating something entirely other into yourself. Slowking takes this even further. When the shelter clamps onto Slowpoke's head instead of its tail, the resulting interaction is even more transformative. Slowking becomes one of the most intelligent Pokémon in the series, capable of solving any problem it encounters and possessing an insight into the nature of the world that other Pokémon do not have. The difference between Slowbro and Slowking is entirely a matter of where the attachment happened. Same Pokémon, same shelter, different point of contact, radically different outcome. What does it mean that where you are touched can determine what you become? The Pokémon Rotom is one of the more genuinely strange concepts the series has produced, because its strangeness is low-key enough to be easy to miss. Rotom is a plasma Pokémon, a being of electrical energy that can possess and inhabit household appliances. In its base form, it is a small, crackling entity with a playful disposition. But when it enters a washing machine, a lawnmower, a refrigerator, a fan, or an oven, it becomes something genuinely different. Its type changes, its available moves change, its general temperament is described as adapting to the function of whatever it has entered. Rotom in a washing machine is not Rotom driving a washing machine. It is Rotom that has, at least partially, become a washing machine. This raises a question about identity that the games do not linger on. If Rotom in a refrigerator is a different Pokémon functionally from Rotom in an oven, in what sense is it the same Pokémon? The same underlying entity occupies different shells and becomes different things while doing so. The games treat this as a single Pokémon with multiple forms, which is mechanically coherent. But philosophically, the situation is more like one consciousness, exploring different modes of being, trying on different identities to see what each one feels like. Rotom is the Pokémon that most explicitly plays with the idea that form and self are separate things, that who you are is not determined by what you currently look like. The Nuzlocke challenge is not part of official Pokémon lore, but it has become part of Pokémon culture in a way that illuminates something real about how the games feel. In a Nuzlocke run, any Pokémon that faints is considered dead, not merely fainted, and must be released or deposited permanently. The challenge imposes on the game the emotional stakes that its lore implies, but its mechanics usually obscure. Pokémon are companions. They face danger. They can be harmed in ways that matter. The Nuzlocke challenge forces the player to experience Pokémon loss as genuine loss, and the communities that form around discussing those losses treat them with a seriousness that reveals how deeply players connect to these digital creatures. There is something worth pausing over in the fact that a game designed for children produces emotional experiences serious enough that adults have created systems to intensify and examine those emotions. The bond between trainer and Pokémon that the games describe, the bond that shapes evolution and powers friendship mechanics, is apparently real enough in the player's experience to warrant rituals of grief when it is severed. The Nuzlocke challenge is not a cynical modification of the games. It is a sincere engagement with what the games are actually about, which is connection and what connection costs. The mystery of where Pokémon go when they are released is one that the anime has addressed more than the games, but never fully resolved. Ash has released Pokémon throughout the series. Each release is presented as a meaningful choice, made for the sake of the Pokemon's well-being or development. But what happens to those Pokemon afterward is left mostly to inference. They return to the wild, they continue to grow, they perhaps encounter other trainers. The implicit suggestion is that a Pokemon that has been with a trainer carries that experience forward into whatever life follows. The bond does not require proximity to persist. This is a gentle mystery rather than an alarming one. It does not demand resolution. It simply asks the player to trust that things continue beyond the frame of what can be seen, that the Pokemon who left the party are still somewhere, still themselves, carrying their history with them into whatever comes next. The world is large enough for that. The world has always been large enough for that. The Pokemon Ditto deserves a moment of careful attention because its existence raises questions that are easy to gloss over in service of its mechanical usefulness. Ditto is a transformed Pokemon capable of reshaping its entire body to precisely replicate any other Pokemon it encounters. It is used in breeding because it can become a compatible partner for nearly any species. It is found in various locations across different regions. Its origins are officially unclear, but certain Pokédex entries describe Ditto as a failed attempt at replicating Mew, a prototype that did not quite achieve what the experiment intended. If this is true, then Ditto is not simply a shapeshifter. It is an imperfect copy of the world's original Pokémon, a creature that carries within itself the DNA of everything, the potential to become everything, and yet cannot fully settle into any single permanent form. Ditto's resting state is the simplest thing possible, a small, lavender blob with dots for eyes. Everything else it becomes is borrowed, temporary, a role it plays rather than a self it inhabits. The question of whether Ditto has a self that is separate from the forms it takes is one that the games do not ask. But the possibility that it does not, that the blob is all there is, carries a weight that is worth sitting with. Metagross is a Pokémon that formed by the merger of two Metang, and each Metang formed by the merger of two Beldum. The end result is a Pokémon whose brain is the combined product of four original organisms, each of which was already a fusion. Metagross is described as possessing intelligence that exceeds that of any supercomputer, the result of four linked brains operating simultaneously. What Metagross thinks about is not described. Whether those four original minds retain any individuality within the combined whole is not addressed. But the idea of intelligence as a function of connection, of cognitive capacity as something that can be multiplied through merger, is a genuinely unusual concept for a creature designed to contain. The idea of merger and fusion runs through Pokémon biology in ways that are easy to take for granted. Magneton is three Magnemite that have come together. Dugtrio is three Diglett. In these cases, the merger appears to produce a new entity, rather than a collaboration between three separate ones. The individual components seem to lose their independent status when the combination is complete. And what that process feels like from the inside of each component is an unanswerable question, and yet it is the kind of question that, once noticed, stays with you. There is a specific feeling that the Pokémon world produces when you explore it at night. The games have always been careful about nighttime. The music shifts, the Pokémon that appear in tall grass change, the colors of the world darken in ways that suggest a genuine difference between the world by day and the world after dark. This is not merely aesthetic. In the lore, certain Pokémon are nocturnal in ways that affect their behavior, their hunting patterns, and their relationship to human settlements. Murkrow gathers at night and is described as being capable of leading wanderers astray. Mismagius casts curses at night, reciting incantations that cause misfortune for those who hear them. Banette haunts the places where children's toys are abandoned. The night in the Pokémon world is inhabited differently than the day. The creatures that populate it have different relationships to human presence, and the lore surrounding them suggests that darkness in the Pokemon world is not merely the absence of light. It is a condition that activates certain kinds of life, draws out certain kinds of behavior, and creates certain kinds of risk. Players who have spent time wandering routes at night in the games will often describe a different quality to that experience, something quieter and slightly less certain than the daytime equivalent. Umbreon is a Pokemon that belongs to the night in a specific way. It evolved from Eevee through a bond of friendship developed in the dark, which means that the night itself was part of what shaped it. Its rings glow in the darkness, and those glowing rings are described as capable of intimidating and disorienting enemies. Umbreon is a creature that has internalized darkness and made it functional, turned the absence of light into a source of its own. This is consistent with the broader logic of how Pokemon evolve in response to their environment, but Umbreon is one of the clearest examples of an environment as specific as the nighttime hour producing a form as specific as a moon-marked dark Pokemon. The world's caves are another location where the Pokemon world's mysteries concentrate. Caves are transition spaces, places between the surface and whatever lies beneath it. In Pokemon games, caves are also places where rare Pokemon are found, where ancient events left marks in stone, where the geography becomes uncertain and the sense of depth extends further than expected. Mount Moon in Kanto is one of the earliest examples. It is described as a place where meteor showers land frequently, which is why moonstones are found there. But it is also where Clefairy and Clefable live, deep in the cave, away from human contact. The Clefairy evolutionary line carries one of the more intriguing lore threads in the series. Clefairy are found at high altitudes and in craters, in places where meteorites are found. Certain Pokédex entries describe them as having come from space, as having arrived on a meteorite long ago and settled in mountain environments where the stone beneath them felt familiar. The idea that Clefairy are not native to the Pokemon world, that they are visitors who arrived on a falling star and decided to stay, is presented as a quiet detail rather than a dramatic revelation. But if it is true, then Clefairy represents something unusual in a world full of unusual things, evidence that life exists beyond the edges of the Pokemon world, and that it occasionally finds its way here. The Elgyem line carries a similar suggestion. Elgyem is described as having appeared approximately 50 years ago in the desert, and its anatomy strongly suggests a connection to UFO sightings and depictions of extraterrestrial life. The 50-year timeline places its arrival within living memory in the Pokemon world's present, which means there are people who remember when Elgyem did not exist and then suddenly did. What it was doing before it arrived and where it came from is not described. The lore simply notes the arrival and declines to explain it. This is consistent with how the Pokemon world handles its largest mysteries. The door opens just enough to reveal that there is a space beyond it, and then it stays where it is. The ocean zones in Pokemon games, accessible by surfing, are one of the places where the world reveals its scale most clearly. Those deep blue tiles, populated by Tentacool and Wingull in the early routes, but home to stranger things further out, suggest an ocean that extends beyond what the map shows. In Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, there is a route that takes players far out into open water, far from any visible land, where the music changes and the feeling of isolation becomes part of the experience. This is where certain rare encounters happen, encounters with Pokemon that exist only in those open waters, away from anything that could be called a coastline. What lies at the deepest parts of the Pokemon Ocean is a question the games have addressed through specific locations like the seafloor cavern where Groudon sleeps, or the deep trenches accessed in later generations. But the surface of those answers only makes the depth more visible. The ocean in the Pokemon world is not fully explored. It is not fully known, and the things that live in its deepest parts are aware of the world above them in ways that the world above them does not quite understand. Wailord is the largest Pokemon that can be obtained through ordinary gameplay in most generations. Its size is staggering in a way that the game's scale makes easy to underestimate. It is longer than 6 of the largest buses lined up end to end, yet it has a density so low that it would float in water, which raises mechanical questions about how it actually swims in the Pokemon world. Wailord is one of those creatures whose size makes it more than an animal. It is a landmark, a moving geography. Its song, which Wailmer produces, and Wailord presumably continues, can be heard over enormous distances in the ocean. The communication happening between these creatures, across miles of open water, is something the games acknowledge without describing. Lapras is a Pokemon with a gentleness in its description that makes its historical situation more poignant. It was once widely hunted, and its population was reduced nearly to the point of disappearance. This is one of the relatively few cases in the Pokemon world where human action is described as having caused lasting harm to a species in a way the games treat as regrettable rather than neutral. Lapras remembers those times in a way its Pokédex entries seem to suggest, and its wariness around strangers is presented as earned rather than simply characteristic. The world of Pokemon has a conservation history, and that history is not uniformly positive. The concept of fossil Pokemon is one that the series has returned to many times, and each return raises similar questions in slightly different forms. Ancient Pokemon, preserved in stone over millions of years, can be restored through scientific processes and become living functional members of a modern Pokemon team. This is presented as an accepted practice, a legitimate use of technology, and a way of reconnecting the present with the deep past. But the experience of the restored Pokemon is worth considering. It wakes into a world that is not its world. Every other member of its species has been gone for millions of years. The landscape it evolved to inhabit is unrecognizable. The climate has changed. The other creatures it coexisted with are gone. It is in the most literal sense possible, alone in a way that cannot be remedied. The games do not address this. The restored fossil Pokemon function like any other Pokemon. They can be trained, they can form bonds, they can become cherished members of a team, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the bond with a trainer provides something that replaces what was lost. But the fact that this never comes up in the games, the silence around the strangeness of resurrection into alienness, is a kind of mystery in itself. The world moves forward. The Aerodactyl adjusts. The Kabuto learns to navigate the present, and whether they carry the weight of that displacement or set it down somewhere along the way is a question the games trust the player to imagine. The Fairy type, introduced in the 6th generation, retroactively changed the way certain older Pokemon were understood. Pokemon like Clefairy, Togekiss, and Gardevoir, which had been categorized under normal or psychic, were revealed to have been fairy types all along. The lore around the fairy type connects it to the mysterious and the otherworldly, to ancient magic and enchantment, to the kind of power that does not operate through force but through influence. The fairy type's introduction also gave dragon types a meaningful weakness for the first time, which changed the balance of Pokemon in a way that suggests even the fundamental type system of the world is not static, but subject to revision. What is interesting about the fairy type, from a lore perspective, is how it positioned certain Pokemon in relation to mythology. Fairy is connected to old stories, to the kinds of beings that live just outside the edges of the ordinary world and operate by different rules. Cernius is a fairy type legendary, described as the source of life, capable of restoring dying ecosystems. Its counterpart, Yveltal, is a flying and dark type, associated with destruction and the absorption of life energy. Together, they represent a cycle the world requires. But Cernius's fairy typing places it in a category defined by enchantment and mystery rather than power, which feels like a deliberate statement about what kind of force life actually is. Pokémon Legends. Arceus offered a rare opportunity to see the Pokémon world at a much earlier point in its history, when the relationship between humans and Pokémon was genuinely uncertain rather than established. In that version of Hisui, which would eventually become the Sinnoh region, most Pokémon were not partnered with humans at all. They were wild in a way that the modern games rarely capture, capable of sudden aggression, protective of their territories, aware of human presence as a potential threat. The peaceful coexistence of the modern Pokémon world was not a default state. It was something that had to be built, negotiated, earned through individual encounters that eventually accumulated into a culture. Watching the earliest partnerships form in that game, watching a Pokémon choose to trust a person who had approached it carefully and treated it with respect, gives a different texture to the trainer-Pokémon relationship in the modern games. Every Pokéball used in a contemporary Pokémon game carries the history of that early, harder work. Every Pokémon willing to enter a Pokéball is choosing a practice that was not obvious and that had to be established through countless small acts of trust and care by people who came before. The mysteries of the Pokémon world do not resolve. That is part of their nature and part of their appeal. They continue to deepen with each new game, each new region, each new mythology added to the layers already present. The questions about what Pokémon think, what they experience, how the world was made, and how it is sustained, where the boundaries of the ordinary end and the extraordinary begins. These are questions the series has always carried without answering. They are the negative space around which everything else is arranged. And in that negative space, there is room for the player's own imagination to settle, to slow down, to notice the quality of stillness that surrounds all the motion and the mystery. The world of Pokémon is enormous in ways that a single game or a single season of the anime cannot fully convey. It is enormous not in the way that empty spaces are enormous, but in the way that something deeply inhabited is enormous. Every corner of it contains history. Every creature in it carries meaning. Every mystery it presents is a doorway into something that cannot quite be named, something that feels important without requiring a clear explanation to be valued. The sense that there is always more to understand, that the next cave or the next route or the next Pokédex entry might contain something worth pausing over, is what has kept people returning to this world for decades. And there is something in that return itself that mirrors what the world is about. The trainer comes back. They bring new questions. They move through familiar places and discover that familiar things look different when examined more carefully, when approached with more patience, when followed to the edges where the certainty runs out and the wondering begins. The world holds its breath at the edge of every unanswered question. And the questions, it turns out, are the most interesting part. They are the spaces between the known and the unknown, where the most interesting things grow quietly, out of sight, waiting to be noticed by anyone willing to slow down enough to look. There is a particular quality to the way certain Pokémon locations feel when you arrive in them for the first time. Not the dramatic locations, not the volcanic peaks, or the legendary guarded chambers, but the in-between places. A small town with a single road leading in and another leading out. A route where the music is gentle and the encounters are few. A patch of tall grass beside a lake that is not marked on the town map as significant. These places do not announce themselves. They simply exist quietly, waiting to be moved through. And yet they often stay in memory longer than the landmark locations because they contain a different kind of detail. the detail of ordinariness, the texture of a world that was built for life to happen in rather than for spectacle to occur in. The Pokemon world has always understood that the gaps between the dramatic moments are as important as the dramatic moments themselves. Routes are not simply connective tissue between dungeons and towns. They are spaces where the world breathes, where the music settles into something unhurried, where the player can walk through tall grass for a while without any specific goal and simply be in the world, aware of the slight uncertainty of what each step might reveal. That uncertainty is gentle. It does not produce anxiety. It produces the particular alertness of someone paying attention to a world that is paying attention back. The way weather works in Pokemon games is worth considering as its own quiet mystery. Weather is not merely a visual effect. It changes the mechanics of battle, the availability of certain Pokemon, the emotional register of the environment. Rain in a Pokemon game feels different from sun, not just visually but experientially. There is something about the shift in color palette, the change in music tone, the sense that the world has altered its mood that produces a real response in the player. In the Pokemon whose presence causes that weather, Groudon bringing harsh sunlight, Kyogre calling forth rain, Rayquaza clearing the skies, makes the weather feel like intention rather than accident. Castform is a Pokemon whose form changes based on the weather it is experiencing. In sunlight, it takes on a warm, round appearance. In rain, it becomes a water droplet. In hail, it becomes a small ice crystal. Its normal form is a neutral white sphere, the weather equivalent of potential. What makes Castform interesting is not any individual form, but the fact that it contains all of them simultaneously. It is, at any given moment, whichever version of itself the world currently requires. The form is not a disguise. It is a genuine expression of what the environment has made possible. Castform is a reminder that identity in the Pokemon world is often not fixed, but responsive, shaped by the conditions that surround it. The concept of held items in Pokemon battles opens a small door into the economic and cultural life of the Pokemon world that is rarely fully explored. Berries can be grown and consumed, stones can be found and wielded. Specific items with specific mechanical effects exist in quantities that suggest production and distribution systems beyond what the games show directly. Someone makes citrus berries available in Pokémon centers. Someone decided that a piece of metal called a choice band would increase a Pokémon's attacking power at the cost of move versatility. The infrastructure behind the items in Pokémon battles suggests an entire economy and research tradition that operates entirely off-screen. The Pokemon world's medical infrastructure is another dimension that reveals itself only in fragments. Pokemon centers restore health. Pokemon are healed from status conditions, from the accumulated damage of battle, from states of unconsciousness, all through a technology that is never fully described. Nurse Joy, who operates every Pokemon Center in every region, is described as belonging to a large family of nurses who have dedicated themselves to Pokemon care across multiple generations. The Chansey and Blissey who assist her are described as having a natural empathy that makes them ideal caretakers, capable of sensing pain in Pokemon and responding to it with a gentleness that goes beyond training. What the technology inside the Pokemon Center actually does is left deliberately mysterious. A machine receives the Pokemon, sounds play, light flickers, and then the Pokemon are returned, fully healed, as though the damage of the previous battle had not occurred. In early games, this process was described as involving advanced restoration technology developed in partnership with Pokemon like Chansey, but the specifics remain obscure. The Pokemon Center is one of the most consistently present elements of the Pokemon world, and yet what it actually does, how it actually works, is one of the most thoroughly unexplained things the world contains. The Pokemon Professor system is another institution whose internal logic invites more thought than the games provide. Each region has a professor, each named after a tree or plant, each devoted to a specific area of Pokemon research. Professor Oak studies the relationships between Pokemon and humans. Professor Elm studies Pokemon breeding and egg production. Professor Birch studies Pokemon habitats and field behavior. These research focuses are presented as legitimate academic pursuits within the world, with each professor having a staff, a laboratory, and a reputation that extends beyond the region they inhabit. The fact that a research network apparently exists connecting these professors across regions is implied by the games, but rarely made explicit. What is interesting about the professor system is how it sits at the interface between the scientific and the legendary. Each professor operates within a framework that treats Pokemon as subjects of rigorous study. And yet, the world those professors study contains beings like Arceus and Celebi and Zygarde, whose existence challenges any ordinary scientific framework. How do researchers trained in systematic observation respond when the subject of their research is a being that created time? The games occasionally nod toward this tension, but never resolve it. The professors continue their work, and the legendary Pokemon continue to exist at the edges of that work, beyond the reach of most research methodologies. The Rotom Pokédex, introduced in the Alola region, represents a genuinely unusual development in the series' treatment of both Pokemon and technology. The Rotom who inhabits the Pokédex is not simply using the device as a tool. It has integrated itself into a piece of technology and developed a personality shaped by that integration. The Rotom Pokédex learns. It grows attached to the trainer it accompanies. It responds to the places it visits with increasing familiarity. It is, in effect, a Pokemon that has chosen a form of existence that is inseparable from a human artifact. And through that choice, it has become something that did not exist before it made that choice. This is consistent with how Rotom has always worked, but the Rotom Pokédex makes the implications more visible by giving the Rotom an opportunity to develop a relationship with the player over time. It is not merely useful, it becomes fond. It expresses preferences. It occasionally communicates something that reads as genuine investment in the outcome of the journey it is sharing. Whether this constitutes consciousness in a meaningful sense is a question the games are too wise to ask directly. But the experience of interacting with the Rotom Pokédex produces in many players the sense that they are interacting with someone rather than something, and that shift in perception is itself a kind of mystery worth sitting with. The move Memento is one of the most quietly remarkable moves in the Pokemon battle system. When used, the Pokemon using it faints voluntarily, sacrificing itself to sharply lower the opponent's stats. In the context of a battle, it is a tactical decision, but in the context of what it represents, a Pokemon choosing to end its participation in the current moment to give its partner an advantage, it carries a weight that the game does not draw attention to. The Pokemon that uses Memento disappears from the battle, leaving behind a benefit that the next partner can use. The sacrifice is real within the logic of the game, even if the Pokemon will recover afterward. This is one of many places in the Pokemon battle system where the mechanics, if taken seriously, carry implications about what Pokemon are willing to do for their trainers. Moves like Self-Destruct and Explosion, which cause the user to faint, are mechanical tools for high-damage scenarios, but they are also the representation of a Pokemon choosing to push everything it has into a single moment, at the cost of its ability to continue. The voluntary nature of these choices, the fact that the game represents them as things the Pokemon does rather than things done to the Pokemon, is a subtle but significant aspect of how the series frames the trainer-Pokemon relationship. The Pokemon is not a tool being used. It is a partner making choices, including difficult ones. The concept of Pokemon contests, present in Hoenn and Sinnoh, introduces an entirely different dimension to what Pokemon are capable of. In contests, Pokemon are not valued for combat effectiveness, but for the beauty, grace, coolness, cleverness, or toughness they can express. Moves that are useful in battle might not be impressive in a contest. Moves that are flashy or aesthetically interesting, but mechanically moderate, might perform brilliantly in front of a crowd. The contest system acknowledges that Pokemon have qualities that exist entirely outside of combat, and that those qualities can be cultivated and celebrated in their own right. What contests reveal about the world is that there is an audience for Pokemon in the Pokemon world, people who come to watch Pokemon perform, and who have developed the aesthetic vocabulary to appreciate what they see. This is not a small detail. It means the Pokemon world has a culture around Pokemon that extends beyond training and battling, a culture with its own stars, its own traditions, its own understanding of what makes a performance worth watching. The coordinators who dedicate themselves to this path are as legitimate a form of relationship with Pokemon as any trainer, just oriented toward different values. Pokemon breeders represent another orientation that the games include but rarely develop. Breeding in the Pokemon world is presented as both a practical skill for producing Pokemon with desirable traits, and as a form of care that has its own specific knowledge base. Understanding which Pokemon can breed with which, what egg moves can be passed down, how the inherited traits of parents show up in offspring, these are specialized forms of knowledge that imply dedicated practitioners. A Pokemon breeder knows things about Pokemon that a trainer or a coordinator does not know. The world is large enough to contain all of these different kinds of knowing, different relationships to the same beings, each valid in its own context. The Safari Zone concept, present across multiple generations in various forms, raises an interesting question about Pokemon conservation that the games occasionally approach. In the Safari Zone, certain Pokemon can only be caught using specific mechanics, throwing bait or rocks rather than battling. The Safari Zone is described as a protected area where rare Pokemon can live without being subject to the ordinary pressures of the wild. It implies that outside the Safari Zone, those Pokemon face conditions that threaten their populations. The Safari Zone is, in essence, a conservation measure, an acknowledgement that some Pokemon need protection from the world's ordinary dynamics. This acknowledgement sits quietly alongside the rest of the game's relationship to Pokemon collection. The core loop of Pokemon games involves catching and training creatures, which raises questions about what that process means at scale. If every trainer catches multiple Pokemon across their journey, and there are many trainers in the world, what does that mean for wild Pokemon populations? The games do not develop this question explicitly, but the existence of protected areas, of Pokemon conservation wardens, and of Pokédex entries that note declining populations in certain species suggests that the world is aware of it. The world of Pokemon is not entirely naive about the implications of its central activity. The Pokemon world's approach to illness and injury is another area where fascinating details emerge if you look carefully enough. Pokemon can be poisoned, burned, frozen, and paralyzed, all of which have mechanical effects in battle. But outside of battle, in the lore, these conditions carry different implications. A Pokemon that is poisoned is suffering. A Pokemon that is frozen is not merely immobilized, but in genuine danger. The fact that these conditions can be healed by items or by the Pokémon Center technology does not erase the reality of what they are before the healing occurs. The world contains both the conditions and their remedies, and the presence of the remedies does not make the conditions less real. The Pokemon Sableye is described as having evolved in a completely dark environment, deep underground, where it developed the ability to see in complete darkness and began consuming gems to sustain itself. Its diet is entirely mineral. It eats the earth. This is one of several Pokemon whose biology represents a genuine departure from animal metabolic systems in ways that the games present without elaboration. Sableye does not eat plants or other animals. It eats rocks, and over time, the gems in its diet have become embedded in its body, visible through its skin, giving it the appearance of a creature studded with jewels. The line between the creature and its diet has, over a long enough time span, disappeared. Carbink is a Pokemon that is described as having been born in the deep earth, compressed over hundreds of millions of years into its current form. It is made of stone and jewels at a level more fundamental than Sableye's dietary accumulation. Carbink did not eat minerals and incorporate them. Carbink is minerals, animated somehow, alive in a way that requires a different framework than biology ordinarily provides. Diancie, the mythical Pokemon connected to Carbink, is described as a sudden mutation from Carbink, a phenomenon so rare that it almost never occurs, in which a Carbink transforms into something far more refined and far more powerful. The mechanism of this transformation is not explained. It simply happens sometimes when conditions are right in ways that no one has determined. The mystery of why certain evolutionary conditions exist is one that the games have always handled through presentation rather than explanation. Pokemon evolve when they level up, or when they are exposed to certain items, or when they are happy, or when they learn certain moves, or when they are traded to another player. Each of these conditions was apparently discovered or understood enough to be reliably reproduced, which implies research and documentation by people in the Pokemon world. But the why behind each condition is rarely given. Why does trade trigger certain evolutions? What does the experience of being transferred to a new trainer's care do to a Pokemon that produces biological transformation? The games do not know or do not say, and the silence is a kind of answer in itself. Marshadow is a mythical Pokemon that lurks in shadows and absorbs the power and fighting techniques of anyone it watches. It is described as being able to enter shadows and move through them, observing from a position of complete invisibility. It learns by watching. It grows more powerful through the accumulated observation of skilled fighters and trainers, taking something from each encounter without the person it watches being aware of the taking. Marshadow is a Pokemon built around the concept of passive, invisible acquisition, of becoming more by simply being present and attentive in the right spaces. There is something interesting about a Pokemon whose power comes entirely from watching. Marshadow does not compete. It observes. It does not confront. It stays in the shadow at the edge of the encounter and receives something from it. The implication is that the Pokemon world is full of these invisible presences, creatures occupying the spaces between events, gathering information or energy or ability in ways that the participants in the central action cannot perceive. The world is watched by things that cannot be seen. The encounters that feel private are sometimes not. This is a gentle form of unease, the kind that does not resolve into specific fear but simply remains, a background awareness of the inhabited darkness. The concept of a Pokemon's nature, its disposition or personality type, is one that the games introduced as a mechanical system for affecting stat growth. But the naturalistic language used to describe it, hardy, jolly, quirky, naive, careful, lends the system an implication that reaches beyond mechanics. If a Pokemon has a nature, it has a character. And character is the kind of thing that shapes how a creature experiences its life, how it responds to challenge, what it finds easy, and what it finds difficult. Two Pokemon of the same species with different natures are not merely statistically different. They are, in some sense, different individuals, shaped by whatever in their development caused one to be hardy where another is bashful. The randomness of natures in the games, the fact that you cannot reliably predict what nature a wild Pokemon will have, suggests that in the Pokemon world, as in our world, individual personality is not fully determined by species or lineage. It is something that emerges from the particular configuration of an individual's development, not always predictable, not always explainable, and the fact that a nature, once set, stays with the Pokemon throughout its entire life, regardless of how much it grows or how many times it evolves, suggests that character in the Pokemon world is considered something fundamental rather than something that changes with circumstances. You are what you are, at some deep level, regardless of what you become. The mythological weight of the legendary Pokemon of each region accumulates across the series into something that deserves its own slow consideration. Taken individually, each legendary is impressive. Taken together, they form a picture of a universe that is more complex, more layered, and more thoroughly attended to by ancient and powerful beings than any single game's scope can fully communicate. There is a being who created time, a being who created space, a being who was banished to a realm beyond ordinary space and time, a trio of genies who govern thunder, tornadoes, and the earth, a deer who grants wishes at the cost of its own life, a hedgehog who carries a crown of light and whose legend is tied to the concept of truth, a dragon who holds the world in balance and whose dissolution would mean the dissolution of everything else. This is not a simple bestiary. This is a cosmology, a picture of a universe maintained by the presence and activity of beings whose awareness extends far beyond the human scale, and it is a cosmology that exists alongside and partly through the activity of children journeying across regions with 6 Pokemon in their pocket. The scale shift is so dramatic that it should feel absurd. Instead, in the hands of the Pokemon series, it feels like truth. It feels like what the world actually contains: enormous forces and small moments, ancient presences and new friendships, mysteries that go all the way down, and moments of genuine quiet that sit at the surface, available to anyone paying attention. The stars above the Pokemon world are worth considering for a moment. The night sky appears in certain games, accessible from locations with open skies, rendered with the care that the series gives to environments it wants players to notice. Pokemon like Clefairy are associated with specific stars. The Pokemon Jirachi wakes every 1,000 years when a comet passes close to the world, grants wishes, and then returns to sleep. The existence of Jirachi implies that the world and the stars above it are in relationship, that cosmic cycles determine when certain powers are available and when they are not. The sky is not a backdrop. It is part of the system. What happens in the Pokemon world between visits by the player is one of the questions the series has never directly addressed, but which the world's construction implies has a real answer. The Pokemon world continues. Towns keep their schedules. The professors continue their research. The gym leaders are in their gyms, presumably, waiting with steady patience for challengers who may arrive in any season. The wild Pokemon in roots and caves go on living. The legendary Pokemon slumber or move or go about the vast and patient activities of their existence. The world does not pause when the player stops playing. It is, at minimum, implied to continue. This implied continuity is part of what makes the Pokemon world feel real in a way that is specific to this franchise. The world exists before you arrive in it and will exist after you leave it. Your journey through it is real to you, but the world's reality does not depend on your observation of it. This is philosophically significant and quietly extraordinary for a game. Most games exist for the player. The Pokemon world exists alongside the player, which is a different relationship entirely. The Pokemon Move Splash is, famously, completely useless in standard battle conditions. It does nothing. Its description in various forms indicates that it is a move Pokemon use to splash around. It was originally exclusive to Magikarp, the Pokemon most associated with helplessness and eventual transformation. The uselessness of Splash is part of Magikarp's design, the idea that a Pokemon can be genuinely without power and still be on its way to becoming something extraordinary. Gyarados, Magikarp's evolution, is one of the most powerful Pokemon in the original games, capable of sweeping entire teams. The distance between Splash and that power is one of the largest evolutionary gaps in the series. What Magikarp represents in the Pokemon world's mythology is something worth sitting with. It is the Pokemon that is almost defined by what it cannot do, by the gap between its current state and its potential, and the transformation into Gyarados, which comes simply from persisting long enough, is one of the most earnest things the series has ever communicated. The only thing required of Magikarp is that it continue to exist. The becoming takes care of itself if the conditions are maintained. There is something quiet and reassuring about a world where that is true, where the path from Splash to something remarkable is simply a matter of time and care. The Pokemon world contains several locations described as places where dimensions or realities overlap, where the boundary between the ordinary world and something else becomes thin enough to feel. The Old Chateau in Sinnoh is one of these places, a ruined mansion where ghost-type Pokemon wander through rooms that appear to be inhabited by memories rather than people. The images on the walls, some of which move, and the eyes that sometimes appear in places they should not be, suggest a location where something happened that has not fully finished happening. The past is present there in a way it is not elsewhere. The presence of the past is a theme that runs through the entire Pokemon series in gentle, consistent ways. The ruins of previous civilizations, the artifacts of ancient practices, the legendary Pokemon whose existence predates human memory, all of these carry the weight of what came before. The Pokemon world is a world that has happened to itself many times over, that has seen great events whose consequences shape the present in ways that the present does not fully understand. The player moves through a landscape of consequences, most of which are never named. Pokemon contests in Hoenn, Pokemon musicals in Unova, Pokemon showcases in Kalos, and Pokemon performances in various forms all point toward a consistent truth about the world. Pokemon have a performative dimension to their existence that exists independently of battle. They can dance, they can be groomed, they can develop appeal in categories that have nothing to do with combat effectiveness, and the world watches these performances and responds to them with genuine appreciation. The audience is real. The culture around performance is real. The Pokemon who excel at it are genuinely excellent at something meaningful within the world they inhabit. The way the Pokemon world handles genius is worth a quiet look. Certain trainers in the games are described as prodigies, people who understood Pokemon at an unusually young age, or who developed strategies that revolutionized competitive training. Champions, Elite Four members, and gym leaders are all described in their character bios as having reached their positions through genuine mastery. The Pokemon world does not distribute exceptional ability evenly. It has people who are genuinely better at what they do than others, and those people have worked to become so. The world is not a place where effort guarantees outcome, but it is a place where effort is consistently respected. What the games often leave unexamined is the emotional cost of training at that level. The champion, who has devoted a life to becoming the best trainer in the region, has made choices that the player glimpses only through the distorted lens of their title and their battle team. What did they give up? What did they carry with them through the years of training? The Pokemon they chose to be their partners, who have been with them through all of it? No. And in the moments of battle, before the dialogue ends and the outcome is decided, those Pokemon are there, carrying everything. The idea of a Pokemon as keeper of its trainer's history is one that the series implies without stating. A Pokemon that has been with a trainer since it was caught as a baby on the first route of the game carries a record of everything that happened between that moment and the final battle. Every route walked, every gym defeated, every friend made, and every rival encountered. The Pokemon was there for all of it, and the care that trainer showed, or did not show, is recorded in the friendship stat, in the nature of the bond, in the way the Pokemon responds when called into the most important moments. This is, in the end, what the mysteries of the Pokemon world all circle back toward. Not the creation myths, not the legendary cosmologies, not the unanswered questions about animals and ghosts and dimensional spaces, but the relationship between a person and a Pokemon, played out over time, shaped by choices, and recorded in both of them in ways that cannot be fully translated but can be felt. Every great mystery in the Pokemon world points towards something smaller and more intimate at its center. The world was made. History happened. Legendary beings moved through the centuries. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, a trainer and a Pokemon found each other, and that finding meant something. The questions the Pokemon world asks, the ones it does not answer, are built around that meaning. What does it mean to choose a companion? What does it mean to grow alongside something? What do we carry with us from the places we have been and the beings we have known? These are not small questions. They are the questions that the world is organized around. And the fact that they are asked through the medium of catching small creatures and training them to battle does not make the questions smaller. It makes the medium more remarkable. The concept of Pokemon habitats is something the games communicate through encounter tables and location descriptions, but rarely through extended lore. Yet the habitats themselves, if examined, reveal a world of ecological specificity that is easy to absorb without consciously noticing. Marill is found near rivers and lakes, not because rivers and lakes are merely convenient locations, but because Marill's biology and behavior are shaped by those environments. It plays in rivers, it uses its buoyant tail to stay afloat, and it can navigate current in ways that suggest deep evolutionary adaptation to moving water. Marill did not happen to be found near rivers. Marill was made by rivers through millions of years of selection in exactly those environments. The diversity of Pokemon habitats reflects a diversity in the Pokemon world's ecosystems that the games communicate through accumulated detail rather than explicit description. Caves host different communities than forests. Deserts support life that could not survive elsewhere. Deep ocean trenches host Pokemon whose biology assumes complete darkness and crushing pressure. The world is genuinely varied in the way that real ecosystems are varied, with each zone having its own logic, its own community of organisms, and its own set of rules for what can survive there and what cannot. Tropius is a Pokemon that evolved in lush, tropical environments and became so adapted to its habitat that it developed the ability to grow fruit around its neck. Its Pokédex entries describe children in the areas where it lives, coming to it for snacks, gathering around it the way they might gather around a fruit tree in our world. Tropius is, in some sense, both an animal and an orchard. It occupies a niche in its ecosystem that is partly vegetative, growing a harvest on its body that feeds other species. The boundary between organism and resource is blurred in Tropius in a way that is consistent with how the Pokemon world generally handles the complexity of living things. The mystery of exactly how Pokemon evolved in the Pokemon world and whether that evolution followed anything like the biological mechanisms that produce evolutionary change in our world is one that the games approach most directly through the fossil Pokémon and through the mythology of the original Pokémon. The fossil record exists. Ancient forms of life existed that are different from what exists now. Pokémon have changed over geological time, but whether the mechanism of that change was anything like natural selection, or whether it involved the influence of legendary Pokémon, or whether some principle entirely specific to the Pokémon world was operating, is never clarified. Flareon, Vaporeon, Jolteon, Espeon, Umbreon, Leafeon, Glaceon, and Sylveon all evolved from Eevee through different pathways, but they evolved from a single ancestral Pokémon rather than from separate lineages. This means Eevee carries within it the genetic potential for all of these forms, a range of biological possibility that no real organism possesses. The fact that each form is stable, self-consistent, and genuinely different from the others, rather than being a compromise between all of them, suggests that Eevee's biology operates on principles that are specifically Pokémon, tied to mechanisms of transformation that have no direct equivalent in evolutionary biology as we understand it. The Pokémon world's handling of memory is another thread that runs quietly through the series without being pulled into explicit discussion. Certain Pokémon are described as having very long memories. Slowking's enhanced intelligence includes an enhanced capacity to remember and analyze. Metagross possesses total recall of everything it has ever processed, a library of experience that grows throughout its life without loss. Alakazam's memory is so extensive that it reportedly remembers everything that has happened to it from before it was even born, which raises the question of what pre-birth experience looks like for a psychic-type Pokémon whose mental capacity is extraordinary. Memory and identity are closely linked in ways that Pokémon lore occasionally makes explicit. Yamask carries a mask that is a record of its previous identity as a human, and its grief when looking at that mask is described as genuine. Sigilyph guards ancient ruins, not out of duty exactly, but out of inability to forget the purpose it was given, in a civilization that no longer exists. It continues its patrol because to stop would require forgetting something it is not capable of forgetting. This is a form of loyalty that has outlasted the object of the loyalty, a commitment sustained by memory long after circumstance has changed. The ruins that Sigilyph guards are ruins of a desert civilization in Unova, and Sigilyph was apparently created by that civilization to serve a protective function. Its existence is evidence of a world in which Pokémon were sometimes created intentionally by human hands for human purposes, not bred or caught, but manufactured or summoned for specific roles. This practice, implied also by the creation of Mewtwo and by the mythology around Pokémon like Golurk, who was created as a protector by ancient people, suggests a historical relationship between humans and Pokémon that involved a degree of deliberate creation that the modern world has apparently left behind. Golurk is worth its own moment of attention. It is a giant clay and stone automaton, animated by a power sealed inside it, whose nature is not fully described. It was made by ancient people as a guardian, and it has continued in that role long after the people who made it are gone. Golurk is a construction that has outlived its creators, continuing to fulfill a purpose in a world where the context for that purpose has entirely dissolved. It patrols, it protects. It does not appear to struggle with the question of what it is protecting or why. The purpose was given to it, and the purpose remains, and Golurk continues. There is something that sits between tragedy and dignity in the idea of a Pokémon still performing a function whose original context is gone. Golurk is not confused. It is not searching for direction. It simply continues, because continuation is what it was made for. And in continuing, It preserves something of the civilization that made it not as a record or a memorial, but as an active presence, a guardian still guarding a world that is not quite the world it was made to guard. The world changed around it. Golurk did not. The Pokemon world's approach to sleep connects to something broader about how the series treats rest, recovery, and the rhythm of activity and stillness. Pokemon Centers provide full restoration overnight in some game iterations. Certain Pokemon are described as requiring unusually long periods of sleep to function. Snorlax, famously, sleeps for most of its life and wakes primarily to eat. The sleep of a Snorlax is not a vulnerability exactly, though blocking paths does create problems for travelers. It is simply the correct proportion of sleep to wakefulness for that kind of being. Snorlax has found its balance point, and that balance involves a great deal of stillness. The Pokemon world does not pathologize excessive sleep the way our world often does. It observes it, documents it, and accommodates it. Routes that Snorlax blocks become navigable once the Snorlax has been woken, but the Snorlax itself is not blamed for blocking the route. It was simply there, being what it is. The world adjusts to the presence of large, sleeping things, rather than demanding that the large, sleeping things adjust to the world's schedule. This is a small accommodation that suggests something about the Pokemon world's general relationship to natural behavior, an acceptance of creatures on their own terms that is easier to maintain in a world where cooperation, rather than control, is the underlying model. The ancient relationship between humans and Pokemon in Hisui, the version of the world before the modern Pokemon era established its current norms, is one that the games began to explore more explicitly in recent years. In that earlier time, Pokemon were genuinely dangerous in a way that the modern world has largely mitigated through generations of familiarity and partnership. Pokemon that in the modern era would not seem threatening were understood in Hisui as beings capable of real harm, capable of frenzying unpredictably, capable of reactions that no amount of preparation fully anticipated. The humans of that time, who chose to approach those Pokemon, to study them, and to attempt partnership with them, were making choices that their contemporaries often found incomprehensible. The work of building the understanding that would eventually become the modern trainer-Pokemon relationship was done by specific people in specific moments of reaching across a significant divide. The fact that modern trainers take that relationship for granted, that they begin their journeys with the expectation of partnership rather than the reality of uncertainty, is the direct result of that earlier work. Every comfortable moment in the modern Pokemon world is downstream of those first uncertain attempts at connection. The Pokemon world's geography includes places where the ordinary rules seem to bend. The Distortion World, the Ultra Space, the various dimensional anomalies that appear in games across the series. Each of these spaces operates on different principles than the ordinary world, and each of them hosts beings or holds conditions that would be impossible in the standard Pokemon environment. The existence of these alternate dimensions is acknowledged matter-of-factly by the scientists and researchers of the Pokemon world, who study them with the same systematic approach they apply to ordinary Pokemon biology. What is interesting about the Ultra Space in particular is how it positioned the idea of other dimensions as not merely different places, but different kinds of place. The Ultra Beasts that inhabit it are not simply exotic Pokemon. They are beings that evolved under conditions so different from the ordinary Pokemon world that they represent a fundamentally different approach to what a living thing can be. Their anatomy, their abilities, and their behavior all reflect an environment whose rules were not the same as the rules that shaped ordinary Pokemon evolution. They are the product of elsewhere, and their presence in the ordinary world is described as genuinely disruptive, not because they are malicious, but because they are simply so different that ordinary frameworks do not contain them. The Pokemon world's understanding of itself is ultimately always incomplete. This is part of its nature and part of its enduring appeal. Each generation of games adds new pieces to a picture that never quite becomes a full picture. New legendary Pokemon reveal new dimensions of the world's cosmology. New regions reveal new approaches to the relationship between people and Pokemon. New mechanics reveal new ways of thinking about what Pokemon are and what they are capable of. And through all of this accumulation, the core mysteries remain. The world was made, and by what and how is incompletely understood. Pokemon exist, and what they are at the deepest level is incompletely described. The relationship between humans and Pokemon has a history, and that history is incompletely recorded. The incompleteness is not a failure of the world building. It is the world building. A world that answers all its questions becomes a closed thing, contained within its own explanations. A world that holds its questions open remains alive, remains a space that imagination can continue to inhabit. The Pokemon world has always understood this at some level, even if that understanding is not always explicit. The most enduring mysteries in its lore are not loose ends. They are doors left open, invitations to keep wondering, spaces where thought can settle and rest and return, finding the same questions waiting, as patient as they always were. The Pokemon world's approach to color is something that rewards slow attention. Each region has a palette, a dominant visual language that is felt before it is consciously understood. Johto is muted and autumnal, warm golds and deep greens, and the particular gray of old stone. Hoenn is saturated and tropical, vivid blues, and lush, almost overwhelming vegetation. Sinnoh carries the cool weight of mountain light, the blue-white quality of air at altitude where the sky is clearer and everything feels slightly more exposed to the elements. These palettes are not arbitrary. They are expressions of each region's character, its relationship to climate and terrain, and the kind of life it supports. The Pokemon who inhabit each region often reflect its palette in ways that create a visual coherence across the whole. Hoenn's Pokemon are frequently water-adjacent or rain-appropriate, shaped by a region where the ocean is never far. Sinnoh's Pokemon include creatures built for cold, for altitude, for the specific conditions of a land where mountains define the horizon and glaciers move slowly through valleys. The connection between a region and its inhabitants is not accidental. It is the result of a world that maintains ecological consistency even while being, in other ways, entirely unlike our own. The Alola region introduced the concept of regional variance in a way that made explicit something the series had always implied. The same species of Pokemon, placed in a different environment for long enough, becomes something genuinely different. Alolan Vulpix is an ice type rather than a fire type because Vulpix colonized the snowy peak of Mount Lanakila and adapted to its conditions over generations. Alolan Marowak is a fire and ghost type, shaped by the spiritual traditions and the particular climate of the islands. The Pokemon carried the potential for these forms within them all along. The environment drew out what was latent. This concept of regional adaptation is one of the closest points of contact between Pokemon biology and evolutionary biology as understood in our world. The principle that isolated populations develop differently in response to local conditions is a foundation of how species diversify. The Pokemon world applies this principle through a mechanism that is faster and more dramatic than anything our biology produces, but the underlying logic is recognizable. A Pokemon in a new environment becomes a new version of itself, not through the gradual pressure of generations, but through an accelerated process that still requires time, still requires consistency of conditions, still produces genuine biological change rather than mere cosmetic adjustment. Galarian forms extended this further, adding forms shaped not just by climate, but by culture. Galarian wheezing filters pollution and releases clean air, a form shaped by an industrial history. Galarian Rapidash is a psychic-type fairy, shaped by a region steeped in magical tradition and the lore of mystical horses. The Pokémon are not merely adapted to their physical environment. They are adapted to the human cultures that have coexisted with them. The history of a region lives in the forms its Pokémon take. Paldean forms carried the concept, yet further still, introducing Pokémon shaped by the specific conditions of a region built on exploration and education. Each new discovery of a regional form is a small lesson in how environment, in its fullest sense, including cultural and historical environment, shapes the living things within it. The Pokémon world is one in which biology and culture are not separate domains. They interpenetrate, they shape each other continuously, and the diversity that results is not merely decorative, but meaningful, a record of where things have been and what conditions produced them. The concept of Pokémon eggs is one that the series introduced without fully explaining, and that explanation gap is itself a kind of mystery. Pokémon reproduce through eggs, most of them anyway. Certain Pokémon, particularly those of legendary status, are described differently, sometimes as having no gender and no capacity for reproduction in the ordinary sense, sometimes as simply being singular, the only one of what they are. But for the majority of Pokémon, the egg exists as the transition between whatever came before and the creature that emerges, a bounded space of transformation that contains a life in progress. What happens inside a Pokémon egg is never described. The games show eggs as opaque, patterned objects that eventually hatch in response to the attention and movement of a trainer. They are warmed in some sense by proximity to active Pokémon. They respond to care. The conditions that trigger hatching are not purely biological. They involve the presence of a trainer who is moving through the world, walking routes and cycling paths, maintaining the motion that seems to be necessary for whatever process occurs inside the shell to reach completion. This is one of the stranger aspects of Pokémon reproduction when examined closely. The egg does not hatch when it is ready in any biological sense that can be independently verified. It hatches when someone who cares about it has moved far enough with it close by. The egg responds to engagement, to the presence of intention, as though what grows inside requires not just warmth and time, but the particular quality of being accompanied by someone who is going somewhere. The hatching of a Pokémon egg is described in the games with the same mechanical simplicity as any other event. Steps are taken, a threshold is crossed, the egg moves, and light appears, and then a Pokémon is there, a baby version of something that will eventually become larger and more capable. But the moment itself is worth sitting with. Something that was not quite present becomes fully present. A creature that was in the process of becoming arrives at the state of being. That transition from almost to fully is one of the most remarkable transitions there is, and it happens inside a spotted shell, carried in a bag, on the back of a journey. The music of the Pokémon world deserves its own thread of consideration. Each game has its own musical identity, and within each game, each location has its own theme that shapes the emotional quality of the experience of being there. The Route 1. Themes across multiple generations. Each captures something slightly different about what it means to be at the beginning of a journey. Each one has that quality of openness, of possibility not yet narrowed by choices made, of a world still fully available, and each one is slightly melancholy, in the way that all beginnings are slightly melancholy, because a beginning contains within it the knowledge that it will not last. The music of Lavender Town has been discussed extensively, analyzed for its frequencies, argued over for its psychological effects. But set aside the internet legends and simply listen to what the music does. It is sparse. It leaves gaps. It does not fill the space the way the music of other towns fills the space. It creates room for something, and what occupies that room is whatever the player brings. The quiet between the notes is what makes Lavender Town feel inhabited by something that cannot be seen. The music creates the conditions for haunting rather than depicting it. The music of the Pokemon champion battles is another kind of emotional architecture. Each champion theme communicates something specific about what this moment is and what it requires. The tension before the final encounter, the shift in tone once the battle is joined, the particular quality of the music when a champion's last Pokemon falls, these are not incidental. They are the emotional framework within which the player's achievement becomes meaningful. The music tells you what you are feeling, and in doing so, makes you feel it more completely. What the music of the Pokemon world does, across all of its forms and locations and occasions, is create a continuous emotional continuity underlying the visual and mechanical experience of the game. Even players who have not thought consciously about the music of a specific location will often recognize it instantly when they hear it again years later, because the music was doing something they were not aware of. It was recording the emotional tone of each moment and associating it with place and event in a way that persists in memory long after the specific details of what happened have faded. The question of what Pokemon eat is one that the games occasionally surface through specific Pokédex entries and then carefully avoid developing into a complete picture. Many Pokemon are described as having very specific diets. Snorlax consumes enormous amounts of food before sleeping. Munchlax hides food in its fur. Tropius grows fruit it can share. Executor's heads are described as eventually becoming independent execute. The details suggest an ecology of consumption and production, a web of nutritional dependencies that the games imply without mapping. What Pokemon eat in relation to each other is especially interesting. Ghost types that feed on fear or life energy. Psychic types described as sustaining themselves on mental energy. Pokemon that drink electrical current. Pokemon that absorb sunlight. The Pokemon world's energy economy is vastly more diverse than any single biome in our world, incorporating biological, elemental, and occasionally metaphysical forms of sustenance into a system that somehow maintains itself. The prey relationships implied by some Pokédex entries suggest food webs of considerable complexity, operating in the background of a world that is usually concerned with showing you the trainer side of things. The predator-prey dynamics of the Pokemon world are handled with a lightness that contrasts with the occasionally very specific nature of the descriptions. Sharpedo hunts by tracking blood from over a mile away, according to its Pokédex. Ariados traps prey in webs and drains them. Malamar hypnotizes other creatures and then manipulates them for its own purposes. These are not aggressive competitors in the sense that battling Pokemon are aggressive. They are predators operating within a natural food web, doing what their biology requires. The world contains this. It absorbs it into its ordinary functioning without framing it as alarming. Perhaps this reflects something about the relationship the Pokemon world encourages its inhabitants to have with nature. The predation is real, and the danger is real, but neither is something to be shut out or eliminated. It is part of the system, part of what makes the world work. The trainer who encounters a predatory Pokemon in the wild is encountering something that belongs there, that has a role in the ecology that would be disrupted by its absence. This is a more ecologically honest position than much of the Pokemon world's presentation would suggest on first encounter. The geography of roots in the Pokemon world is something that maps show as functional, and that experience reveals as something more. Roots are numbered, which implies a system, an organizing principle that someone applied to the landscape at some point in the world's history. The early roots in each region feel gentle, gradual in their demands, appropriate for someone beginning. The later roots feel different, not simply harder, but more themselves, more committed to a particular character. Desert roots that shimmer with heat, mountain roots where the path narrows and the wind is audible, ocean routes where the horizon is the only visible landmark and the sense of exposure becomes very real. Each route in each region is a specific kind of place, not merely a connector between more important locations. The tall grass that lines the paths is not just a game mechanic for random encounters. It is the representation of a world in which the human paths through nature are only maintained with effort, in which the wild is always immediately adjacent to the root, always present, always containing more than the civilized path makes visible. The roots are corridors through a world that extends in all directions beyond what can be walked on a specific path. The Pokémon Center as an institution has a quality to it that is easy to appreciate without examining. It is free. There is no charge for healing Pokémon. No transaction is required. Every town, regardless of its size or wealth, has a Pokémon Center that offers complete restoration at no cost. This is a detail that the games present as self-evident, as simply the way the world works, but it implies a significant social and economic arrangement that is never described. Someone pays for the Pokémon Centers, someone trains the Nurse Joys, someone develops and maintains the technology. The infrastructure of Pokémon care is enormous, distributed across every inhabited region of the world, and it costs nothing to access. What this reveals about the values of the Pokémon world is worth sitting with. The care of Pokémon is treated as a public good, something provided universally because its importance is understood to benefit everyone. The world has decided at some point that the well-being of Pokémon is not something that should be contingent on individual wealth. It is something that every trainer, regardless of their means, should have full access to. This is a quietly remarkable economic decision embedded in what appears to be simple game design. The world is more generous than it explicitly states. The Pokémon Nurse Joy family represents another curiosity that the world presents without fully explaining. Every Pokémon Center in every region is staffed by a Joy, and every Joy has the same name and the same characteristic appearance. This is sometimes played for comedy in the anime, where characters struggle to tell them apart or are surprised to discover that multiple Joys exist. But the lore treats it as simply the way things are. The Joys are family members who have taken on a shared vocation, and apparently a shared identity marker. What this means for the individual Joys is something the games do not examine. Each one is a specific person with specific experiences and specific relationships and a specific history of caring for specific Pokémon. The shared name and shared appearance do not erase that individuality, even if they make it easy to overlook. The Joy in Lavender Town is not the same as the Joy in Cerulean City. They have worked in different places, cared for different Pokémon, been part of different communities. The surface similarity contains a depth of individual variation that the games acknowledge only in passing. The Pokémon world's treatment of language is another detail that becomes more interesting the longer it is considered. In the games, every character speaks a common language. Regional differences in naming suggest that different cultures use different terms for the same things, but the barrier of translation is never an obstacle for the player. The anime occasionally gestures at the idea of Pokémon from different regions having different communication patterns, but this is not consistently developed. The world communicates fluidly across vast distances and diverse origins, which implies a long history of contact and exchange that the games never describe in detail. What did the Pokemon world look like before that common language existed? What did the early contact between people from different regions feel like when the traditions and the Pokemon and the landscape were entirely unfamiliar? The history of how the Pokemon world became as interconnected as it is, the trade routes and sea lanes and communication networks that bind Kanto to Johto to Hoenn to Sinnoh, is a history that is entirely implied and never narrated. The world we enter in the games is already the product of enormous amounts of historical integration. The work of that integration is behind us, completed before the journey began. The Pokemon world has a relationship with ancient technology that is distinctive and slightly mysterious. Certain ruins contain mechanisms that are clearly artificial, clearly functional, and clearly far beyond what would be expected of a society that appears to have been pre-industrial. The sealed ruins in various regions contain puzzles and locks and chambers that were clearly designed by someone with a sophisticated understanding of both Pokemon and engineering. The Unown chambers in Johto, the ancient ruins in Hoenn, the Sinjoh ruins that connect Sinnoh and Johto, all of these suggest that ancient peoples possess technical and mystical knowledge that the modern world does not fully possess or comprehend. This implies a loss of knowledge that is usually not made explicit but is present throughout the series. The modern Pokemon world has access to more technology in terms of computational power and communication than any ancient civilization. But the ancient civilizations appear to have understood Pokemon in ways that modern research has not replicated. They built structures that still function thousands of years later. They understood how to work with legendary Pokemon in ways that required direct collaboration. They developed writing systems, the Unown themselves may be a writing system, that encoded meaning in ways that modern scholars can only partially recover. The relationship between past knowledge and present capability is one of the series' most consistent quiet themes. The player often recovers or activates things that ancient people built, and in doing so, accesses power that the present-day world could not have created on its own. The ancient world was not merely a primitive version of the present. It was a different kind of world, organized around different principles and in possession of different forms of understanding. The modern world inherits its ruins and its artifacts and its puzzles, and works backward from them toward knowledge that was once ordinary but is now extraordinary. Regis, Regirock, and Registeel are three Pokemon that embody this dynamic in a very specific way. They are golems created by Regigigas, the master whose legend describes it as having towed the continents into their current positions using ropes. These three Pokemon were sealed in ancient chambers by civilizations that could create them but perhaps could no longer control them, or perhaps created them for purposes that eventually became unnecessary. They wait in those chambers, dormant, holding the particular quality of power that exists in potential without expression, for anyone who knows the sequence required to unlock them. The sequence required involves understanding inscriptions in Braille, a writing system used by blind people in our world that the Pokemon world's ancient civilization apparently also used for reasons that are never explained. The inclusion of Braille is one of the stranger details in the series, a connection between the Pokemon world and a very specific aspect of our world that does not quite resolve into a clean explanation. Whether it was a deliberate puzzle design choice that created an interesting play experience, or whether it implies something deeper about the ancient civilization that created the Regis, is a question worth holding gently. The Pokemon world's most remote locations tend to be the ones where the most significant lore is concentrated. The mountain peaks where ancient Pokemon sleep. The ocean trenches where impossible things live. the caverns so deep that they reach geological layers that were formed before any human civilization existed. These remote locations are not merely dramatic settings. They are places where the world's oldest layers become accessible, where the distance from ordinary human life makes room for something older and stranger. Rayquaza living in the ozone layer is perhaps the most extreme example of this remoteness. It has lived there, according to the lore, for hundreds of millions of years. It feeds on meteors and microscopic particles carried up by wind currents. It descends only when summoned by the conflict between Groudon and Kyogre, or when something significant enough to warrant its attention occurs in the world below. Otherwise, it remains in the sky's highest reaches, above the weather, above the clouds, in a place where the air is too thin for anything else to live. It is alone up there in a way that is genuinely difficult to imagine, and it has been alone there for a span of time so large that human civilization is a recent and minor event within it. What Rayquaza notices of the world below is an interesting question. Does it observe the rise and fall of civilizations? Does it register the proliferation of human settlements as a change in the world it has watched for so long? The lore does not address this. Rayquaza is described primarily in terms of function, what it does when it descends, what power it possesses, what role it plays in the balance of the world. Its inner life is, like so much of the Pokémon world, present but unaddressed. The concept of mega evolution, introduced in the Kalos region, opened a set of questions about the nature of Pokémon power that the series has approached from multiple angles without settling. Mega evolution requires a keystone, a megastone specific to the Pokémon, and a bond between trainer and Pokémon strong enough to sustain the transformation. It is not available to all Pokémon. It is not available at all times. It is a temporary bond-dependent access to a form of power that the Pokémon could not reach alone, and that the trainer cannot produce without the Pokémon's cooperation. What Mega Evolution feels like for the Pokémon has been described in various ways across the games and related media. Some Mega Evolutions are described as pleasant, an amplification of the Pokémon's power that it welcomes. Others are described as painful, a transformation that strains the Pokémon's body, and that is possible only because the bond with its trainer provides something that makes the pain bearable. This variation is significant. It suggests that Mega Evolution is not a uniformly positive experience, that the power comes at a cost, and that the willingness to bear that cost is part of what the bond between trainer and Pokémon makes possible. The temporary nature of Mega Evolution also matters. The Pokémon becomes something extraordinary and then returns to its ordinary form. The transformation does not persist. Whatever the Mega State is, it is not a destination, but an occasion, a form that exists for the duration of a specific challenge and then releases. This is different from ordinary evolution, which is permanent and cumulative. Mega Evolution is more like a peak performance, a moment of maximum expression that cannot be maintained indefinitely. The world seems to understand that such moments should be occasional, should be special, should not become the permanent baseline. The Z moves of Alola introduced a different expression of the trainer Pokémon bond's capacity to unlock extraordinary power. Where Mega Evolution transformed the Pokémon, Z moves required the trainer and Pokémon to perform together, synchronized in movement, building shared energy that was released in a single, powerful expression. The choreography of Z-move activation, the specific poses, and the particular quality of the connection required, placed the trainer as participant rather than enabler. The bond was not the condition that unlocked the Pokémon's power. It was the mechanism through which combined power was expressed. The Dynamax and Gigantamax phenomena of Galar introduced scale as the primary expression of amplified power, with Pokemon growing to enormous sizes and the landscape of max raid battles becoming a shared challenge requiring multiple trainers to engage a single enormous opponent together. The specific expression of this power in Galar is connected to a phenomenon called the Galar particle, a form of energy native to that region whose source turns out to be the remains of ancient Pokemon who died in conflicts long past. The power that makes Pokemon giant in Galar is, in some sense, the legacy of loss, energy released from ancient endings, and now available to be used. This is an unusual and quietly sobering origin for a mechanic that is visually spectacular. The Dynamax phenomenon is dazzling, the giant Pokemon are impressive, and underneath it is the fact that this power originates in death, in the sediment of ancient battles whose participants are long gone. The Galar region harvests the energy of its history in a literal way, and the questions this raises about what is owed to those ancient creatures and what it means to use their remains as a power source are questions the games gesture toward in their lore before moving on. The Pokemon World's festivals and traditions are another dimension that the games include without fully developing. Each region has its own seasonal rhythms, its own occasions for gathering and celebration, its own relationships to the cycle of the year. The seasons in Unova change the world visibly, altering the appearance of locations and making certain Pokemon available only during specific periods. The Pokemon World Tournament in Black and White, two gathered champions and notable trainers from across multiple regions into a single event, implying a global community of Pokemon trainers connected by shared practice and mutual recognition. The Grand Festival in the contest tradition, the Pokemon Leagues in each region, the various seasonal events that appear across the games, all of these suggest a world with a rich calendar of communal occasions organized around Pokemon. The communities that form around these events are real communities, people who share knowledge, who recognize each other's skill, who maintain traditions across generations. The Pokemon world is not just a world of individual journeys. It is a world of belonging, of culture, of the particular warmth that comes from shared devotion to something. The idea of the Pokemon journey itself, of leaving home at around age 10 and traveling through a region, catching and training Pokemon, challenging gyms, accumulating experience, deserves unhurried consideration because it is strange and also entirely natural feeling within the world that contains it. In our world, we would have significant concerns about 10-year-olds traveling alone through wilderness and cities without adult supervision. In the Pokemon world, this is presented as the appropriate coming-of-age experience, the thing that young people do to learn who they are and what they are capable of. The Pokemon world seems to have collectively decided that the journey is safe enough because Pokemon are there. A trained Pokemon companion is protection, navigation assistance, emergency support, and constant companionship. The world is not without danger, but the danger is navigable with Pokemon alongside you, and the experience of navigating that danger, of learning to trust your partners and yourself, is considered formative in a way that justifies beginning young and traveling far. The journey is not merely a search for badges. It is the world's way of producing adults who know things that cannot be taught in a classroom. What children learn on the Pokemon journey that they would not learn otherwise is a question the games engage through character development more than explicit statement. The rival who begins arrogant learns something about the relationship between confidence and care. The player who begins uncertain learns something about the relationship between capability and commitment. The Pokemon who begin as new and uncertain companions learn something about trust, about what it means to have someone consistently choose them, day after day, through difficulty and ease alike. The world produces these learnings not through instruction, but through experience, through the specific challenges of routes and gyms and rivalries and encounters with things larger and stranger than anything a classroom could contain. The education of the Pokemon journey is experiential in the deepest sense, and the world is structured to provide it. The routes get harder as the journey progresses. The gym leaders get more challenging. The encounters become more demanding. The world is a teacher that calibrates its difficulty to what the student is ready for, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the structure of the journey, moving outward from home through progressively larger challenges, is itself a curriculum. The Elite Four and Champion structure is another educational institution embedded in what looks like a competitive one. The Elite Four members are not simply the strongest trainers in a region. They are usually people who have specific, deep relationships with particular types of Pokemon, who have devoted themselves to understanding a type in a way that goes beyond tactical advantage. The specialist nature of the Elite Four suggests that there is value in depth of focus, in choosing a direction and following it fully, rather than spreading attention across everything equally. The generalist champion, who can handle any type, who has developed the flexible judgment that comes from broad experience, is the product of a journey, while the Elite Four specialists represent an alternative path, the mastery that comes from singular devotion. The victory over the champion is presented as the culmination of the journey, the destination toward which everything else was building. But what the games often quietly acknowledge is that defeating the champion does not end anything. The world continues. The roots remain. The Pokemon not yet caught are still out there. The knowledge not yet gathered is still available. Becoming champion is a recognition, not a conclusion. The journey transforms into something with more dimensions than it had before. The player has proven what they are capable of. Now the question becomes what they will do with it. The post-game content in Pokemon games is, in this sense, a meditation on what comes after accomplishment. The national dex, the legendary Pokemon not encountered in the main story, the battle facilities where mastery can be tested against ever-increasing challenge. All of these are invitations to continue exploring a world that does not run out of things to offer simply because the primary quest is complete. The world remains as large as it was. The question is whether the player wishes to keep discovering it. The Pokemon world treats expertise with a particular kind of respect that is worth noticing. The people who are most skilled at working with Pokemon are not necessarily the people who have battled the most. The breeder who understands genetics and care deeply. The coordinator who has developed an eye for beauty and appeal. The researcher who has spent years observing Pokemon behavior in their natural habitats. Each of these paths produces a different kind of knowledge, and each kind of knowledge is genuinely valuable within the world. The world does not rank them against each other. It simply contains them, makes room for all of them, recognizes that the full understanding of Pokemon requires multiple perspectives, none of which, individually, is complete. This pluralism of expertise reflects something generous about how the Pokemon world is structured. It is not a world where only one kind of success counts. It is a world where the depth of engagement matters more than the form that engagement takes. The trainer who has caught every Pokemon and the trainer who has devoted everything to understanding a single Pokemon completely are both doing something real, both contributing something to the world's collective understanding. The world is large enough for both of them, and for everyone between those extremes. The question of what Pokemon think of each other, independent of their relationships with trainers, is one that the series occasionally surfaces through observed behavior. The descriptions of Pokemon communities in the wild, the way Pokemon protect their territories, raise their young, form alliances, and sometimes conflict with neighboring species, suggest social dynamics of considerable complexity. Pokemon are not isolated units that only come to life in relation to trainers. They have their own lives, their own social structures, their own histories of relationship with the other species that share their habitat. Vespiquen is one of the clearest examples. It governs a colony of Combi with a social structure that mirrors the eusocial organization of real bee colonies, with a single reproductive queen and a large workforce of non-reproductive individuals who perform specific roles. The colony is a collective organism in which no individual is complete without the others. Vespiquen's power in battle draws on that collective, defending with the bodies of its workers, attacking with their coordinated action, healing itself through their care. The individual Vespiquen and the colony it governs are not entirely separable. They are two aspects of a single social entity. This kind of social organization appears in various forms across the Pokémon world, suggesting that collective existence is as viable a strategy for life as individual existence. Wishiwashi's schooling, Vespiquen's colony, the coordinated action of Miltank herds described in certain Pokédex entries, all of these represent approaches to being alive that blur the boundary between individual and group in ways that the Pokémon world accommodates without needing to resolve into a single clean category. There are Pokémon in the series whose existence implies a relationship to human psychology and emotion that goes beyond the physical interactions the games describe. Gardevoir is described as being able to sense the emotions of others and as experiencing strong loyalty to its trainer that it expresses by predicting danger and shielding against it. It is also described as being capable of creating a miniature black hole using the energy of its emotions in moments of extreme feeling. This is an extraordinary detail presented with the same matter-of-fact tone as its height and weight. Gardevoir generates singularities when moved. The boundary between emotion and physics is different in the Pokémon world than in our own. Togekiss is described as appearing before kind-hearted people and sharing in their good fortune. It does not appear to warriors or to those who engage in conflict. It seeks out and is drawn to peace in a way that implies a capacity to read the emotional and ethical quality of a situation with some reliability. Togekiss is not merely attracted to pleasant circumstances. It is described as being capable of recognizing the quality of the people it encounters, of distinguishing between those whose happiness it wishes to participate in and those whose emotional state does not match what it seeks. The Pokémon world contains, in scattered Pokédex entries and lore fragments, descriptions of creatures with moral discernment, with the capacity to respond differentially to ethical quality in their environments. This is an unusual thing for any biological description to include. We do not usually describe the behavior of animals in terms of their response to human goodness or cruelty, at least not in scientific writing. The Pokémon world's descriptive framework is more expansive than that, allowing for the possibility that certain Pokémon have developed, or perhaps always possessed, the capacity to register something like moral quality as a feature of their environment. What this implies about the relationship between ethics and ecology in the Pokémon world is something the series has never made explicit, but the implication is there in the Togekiss that comes to kind people, and the Darkrai that cannot help giving nightmares, and the Celebi that protects forests from harm, and the Malamar that seeks power through manipulation. The world contains creatures oriented toward different qualities of human experience, and those orientations feel less like animal behavior and more like something that has taken a position about what matters. The Pokémon world is a world in which certain creatures care, in the fullest sense of that word, about what humans do and who they are. As the night deepens and the narration finds its way toward stillness, there is one more thread worth following slowly before rest claims you completely. The relationship between the Pokémon world and hope. The series has always been, at its foundation, optimistic, not naive, not without its shadows and its unsettling corners, but genuinely, consistently oriented toward the belief that things can be better, that people and Pokemon can choose to be better, that the world can be improved through effort and care and the quality of the bonds formed along the way. Every villain in the Pokemon world believes something. The leaders of Team Rocket believe that power is what matters and that Pokemon are tools. The leaders of Team Magma and Aqua believe that the world is wrong and must be remade. Cyrus believes that emotion is weakness and that the universe would be purer without it. Each of these beliefs is challenged and ultimately defeated not by superior force, but by the demonstration that the challenger's values, connection, care, relationship are real and powerful in ways that the villain's philosophy cannot account for. The champion's victory over the villain's plan is always also a demonstration of what the trainer-Pokemon bond actually is. It is not a tool relationship. It is not power over another. It is something that grows between two beings who choose each other repeatedly through difficulty, and that becomes more than either of them could produce alone. The Pokemon world insists on this, film after film, game after game, with a persistence that reads as genuine conviction rather than formula. The bond matters, the care matters. The world will resist those who deny this, and the resistance will succeed. That insistence is part of what makes the Pokemon world feel like home. Not a perfect place, not a place without shadow or question or loss, but a place that has decided something, that has organized itself around a belief in the value of connection, and that invites everyone who enters it to participate in that belief, to choose a partner, to care for them, to let the journey change both of you, to discover that what you become together is more interesting than what you were apart. The questions will remain when morning comes. The mysteries will be exactly where you left them, patient and unchanging, waiting for whoever returns to look at them again. And the world will still be there, enormous and detailed and full of creatures who are remarkable in ways that take time to notice. It will wait. It always waits. There is no hurry here. There is a particular feeling that comes from finding something small and overlooked in the Pokemon world, a detail that rewards attention precisely because it was not placed there for the purpose of being noticed. The items hidden in the grass along routes, the books and homes that players can read, the background conversations between NPCs that do not relate to any quest or objective. These details exist for no reason other than to make the world feel more real than a single story requires. They are the texture of a place that is lived in, evidence of a world that extends beyond the boundaries of what the player is meant to care about. The NPC dialogue in Pokemon games is something that players often skim past, drawn onward by the momentum of the journey. But the conversations, when read carefully, contain a portrait of ordinary life in the Pokemon world that is surprisingly specific. A fisherman who has been fishing the same spot for 20 years and swears there is a legendary fish just below the surface. A child who wants to be just like their big sibling when they grow up, and whose big sibling is standing 3 steps away, looking embarrassed. An old woman who remembers when a particular town looked different before the buildings went up and the routes were paved. These are not details that advance the story. They are details that exist because the story takes place inside a world, and a world contains more than any single story. The old woman who remembers a different town is one of the more interesting categories of NPC across the Pokemon series. She carries within her the weight of time in a way that most other characters do not. She has seen things change. She has a comparison that younger characters lack, and the fact that she shares this, unbidden, with a stranger passing through suggests that the memory is something she carries with her, regardless of whether anyone asks. The past is present in her, even when the present has moved on. She is a reminder that the world has depth in the temporal direction, as well as the spatial one, that places have histories that existed before the player arrived in them and will continue after the player leaves. The concept of Pokemon contests as a tradition passed down through families is something that the Ruby and Sapphire games developed through the character of Norman's wife, who introduces contests and whose enthusiasm for them is presented as something that predates the player's arrival by years. Contest traditions in the Pokemon world feel lived in a way that battle traditions also feel lived in. These are things people have been doing for generations, things that have developed their own aesthetics and customs and communities over long enough periods to feel established and ongoing. The player enters into something that was already happening, already had its champions and its history and its accumulated lore about what makes a great performance. The Pokemon world in Pokemon Snap offers a perspective on the creatures that no other game in the series provides with quite the same emphasis. In that game, the player observes Pokemon behaving naturally, without the intervention of battle or the presence of a trainer attempting to direct them. The Pokemon are simply there, doing what they do, and the player's role is to witness it and record it. The relationship between observer and observed is explicitly non-interventionist. You are watching, you are not directing, and what you see when you watch without directing is different from what you see when you are participating. Pokemon sleep, Pokemon play, Pokemon interact with each other in ways that have nothing to do with the trainer-Pokemon relationship that the main series focuses on. They have habits and preferences and relationships with other Pokemon that pre-exist and will continue regardless of whether any human is watching. The game captures this, briefly, in a snapshot. The snapshot is not the thing itself, but it is evidence of the thing. Evidence that the creatures of the Pokemon world have rich existences that extend into the moments when no trainer is present and no battle is occurring. The river in Pokemon games is always moving. This is a small detail that becomes larger the longer you sit with it. Water flows in the background of routes and towns, and that flow is continuous, present even when nothing else is happening. The rivers of the Pokemon world are genuine rivers, not decorative water, and they connect to other bodies of water in ways that maintain a hydrological logic across each region's geography. Following a river in a Pokemon game eventually leads somewhere. The rivers know where they are going, even when the player does not. There are Pokemon who live in rivers specifically, who have adapted to the particular conditions of freshwater flow, who navigate the current in ways that imply a deep understanding of water movement. Phoebus is found in rivers, hidden in specific water tiles that require patience and attention to locate, and its design is deliberately unremarkable, a small, slightly ugly fish that would be easy to overlook. Its evolution into Melodic, considered one of the most beautiful Pokemon in existence, is the series' most direct statement about the gap between appearance and potential, about what is hidden inside unpromising exteriors, about the particular kind of attention required to see what is there, rather than what is easy to see. The beauty of Melodic is not incidental. It is the point. The contrast between what Phoebus looks like and what it becomes is a design choice that communicates something specific about the Pokemon world's understanding of value. The most beautiful thing in the ocean was once the least impressive thing in the river. And the condition for the transformation is not simply time or competition or exposure to a particular element. It is the development of a specific quality, a beautiful condition of the Pokemon itself, cultivated through attention and care. What becomes beautiful is that which was given the conditions for beauty to emerge. The Pokemon world's sky deserves a moment of unhurried attention before this narration finds its resting place. The sky in Pokemon games is visible from everywhere that is not underground. It changes with the time of day. It holds weather. It holds Pokemon who live in it permanently, who have made the air their medium in the way that other Pokemon have made soil or water or stone their medium. The sky is full, not just of clouds and light, but of life, of creatures who navigate its currents and who understand the geometry of altitude in ways that ground-dwelling things cannot easily imagine. Altaria floats on clouds and is described as humming in a voice beautiful enough to put listeners into a dreamy state. It lives at high altitude, where the air is thin and the clouds are sparse, and the light has a particular quality that those who have experienced it describe as clarifying. Altaria in that environment is not simply an animal in a habitat. It is part of a specific quality of experience that only exists at altitude, part of what makes the high sky different from the low sky, part of the reason that mountains in the Pokemon world feel like genuine destinations rather than merely obstacles. Rayquaza, Altaria, Swellow, Staraptor, and the many other Pokemon whose lives are primarily aerial all contribute to a sky that is inhabited in the way that forests and oceans are inhabited, with a community of species that have different niches, different behaviors, different relationships to the medium they share. The sky has its own ecology, its own hierarchies, its own patterns of movement and rest. And from the ground, that ecology is mostly invisible, audible in distant calls, and visible in silhouettes, but not accessible to those who cannot join it. The flying-type gym leaders and the bird Pokemon specialists who appear across the series are, in some sense, people who have found a way to participate in the sky's ecology through their Pokemon. They have developed relationships with beings whose natural domain is above the clouds, and those relationships give them access to a perspective that most people cannot easily reach. The sky is not close to humans in the Pokemon world. It simply requires a partner. It requires a relationship with something that belongs there, and through that relationship, a kind of belonging by association. This is, in miniature, what the entire Pokemon world offers. The deep ocean is accessible through a Pokemon who belongs there. The mountain summit is reachable through a Pokemon who makes its home there. The dark caves are navigable through a Pokemon whose senses are adapted to darkness. The world is not closed to the human who travels with companions. Every environment that would otherwise be inaccessible becomes available through the particular abilities of the creatures who have adapted to it. The trainer does not conquer these environments. The trainer is welcomed into them, temporarily, by the beings who actually belong. The Pokemon world is generous in this way. It does not require that humans master every environment independently. It simply requires that they cultivate the relationships that make participation possible. This is both a practical arrangement and a philosophical position. The world is saying something about what access requires, not dominance, not technological conquest of an environment, but relationship, partnership, the willingness to need something outside yourself in order to go where you want to go. The Pokemon world is large and full of mystery and genuinely strange in places, but underneath all of that is a structure built on the idea that connection makes more possible than isolation, that a creature of limited capability, traveling with partners who extend what is possible, can reach places and accomplish things that pure individual capability could never achieve, that the most interesting journeys are the ones made alongside others. The mysteries will wait. The ruins will hold their secrets until morning. The legendary Pokémon will continue their long and patient existences in whatever spaces they inhabit, unmoved by the passage of one more night. And you, at the end of this particular journey, through questions and reflections and the quiet company of a world that rewards attention, can rest now. The world held you tonight. It will still be there tomorrow, as full of wonder as it ever was, as ready to offer its mysteries to anyone who comes to it slowly and with patience and with genuine curiosity about what it contains. If you drifted with us through all of this and found something worth carrying with you, there is another gentle journey waiting on the left side of your screen. Let it find you wherever you are tonight, and let the world of Pokemon keep its quiet company as sleep takes you.